I returned to Joint Base Lewis McChord on a cold, gray morning in early spring, the kind of morning where the fog hung low enough that the mountains looked like ghost shadows behind the tree line. I had been gone for 9 months, gone in a way most people never come back from, and as the Humvee rolled to a slow stop near the motor pool, I felt the familiar weight of the classified reintegration order sitting inside my jacket. According to every official record, I no longer existed. According to my family, I had probably never mattered, and according to the small group of service members clustered near the vehicles looking at me with open confusion, I was just another intel officer returning from a comfortable desk position after months of pushing paper. I stepped out slowly, boots hitting the pavement with a muted thud, feeling the eyes on me before I even took my first breath of base air. I recognized a few uniforms from a distance, mostly support staff, a handful of new arrivals. And then I heard a familiar voice, sharp and amused with that old tone I remembered from childhood. My stepsister Hannah, Petty Officer First Class, SEAL Pipeline candidate, the golden child of the Carver household. She stood with her teammates, arms crossed, chin lifted the picture of confidence as she looked straight at me and laughed. "So you are back," she said, and the smirk spreading across her face told me she had been waiting for this moment. "I thought you would at least look tougher by now. Even supply clerks look more worn out than that." Her friends laughed with her, and for a second I felt the old pressure in my chest, the same quiet humiliation I had swallowed since I was a teenager in Tacoma. Always underestimated, always judged for being silent, always treated as the weaker Carver. But here on this base, I did not have the luxury of reacting. I was under protocol, my real rank, my real position, my real identity. All of it had to remain hidden until the reintegration briefing, so I kept my expression flat and neutral. She waited for a reaction that I would not give. I felt their stares move over me the way people look at someone they believe they can rank at a glance and dismiss just as quickly. It sparked something inside me, but I kept it contained. Protocol first, mission first, justice later. Hannah stepped closer, lowering her voice only enough for her team to hear. "Honestly, Riley, I thought you were still buried behind a computer somewhere, but look, you actually walked out in the sun." I wondered how long she would keep performing for her audience, but before she finished her next sentence, I heard the thumping in the distance. Slow, rhythmic, and unmistakable. Rotors. Every head turned instinctively. The UH-60 Blackhawk broke through the low fog and descended into the landing zone behind us, kicking up dust and loose gravel. The reaction around me changed in an instant. Laughter stopped. Conversations cut short. Even Hannah faltered mid-sentence as the helicopter settled onto the tarmac. Doors slid open and 4 senior officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their posture commanding. General Bishop, Lieutenant General Harmon, Major General Ruiz, Brigadier General Avery, every single one a figure most soldiers only ever see on briefing slides. They did not look around. They did not ask for direction. They walked straight toward me. The air shifted. Conversations died completely. I stood frozen, not because I was surprised, but because I had been preparing for this moment since the day JSOC told me I would be returning under a false status. But Hannah, her teammates, and the entire row of service members nearby saw something they could not possibly understand. 4 generals approaching an unnoticed intel officer with purpose. The realization spread through the crowd like a silent wave, confusion, disbelief, then something close to fear. The general stopped in front of me. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then General Bishop, the man who had overseen the entire Ghost Vector program and the recovery operation that had nearly taken my life, looked at me with a steady, unshakable respect. "Welcome back, Major Carver," he said, and every syllable hit the pavement louder than the helicopter. And then it happened. The 4 of them stood at attention and raised their hands in a salute meant for one person. Me. A ripple went through the watching crowd. A sense of shock so heavy I could feel the air tighten. Hannah made a small sound behind me, barely audible, lost between disbelief and the collapse of her own pride. I did not turn to look, but I knew the exact second her knees buckled because the crowd shifted and gasped. She had dropped without meaning to. Not out of respect, but out of instinct, out of confusion, out of the realization that everything she thought she knew about me had been wrong since the beginning. I let the salute end, held my breath for one long second, then spoke with the calmness that had carried me through every covert night on foreign soil. At ease. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of my life, the power my family held, the humiliation I had carried, the silence I had lived inside, shattered like glass under the heel of truth. If you have ever been underestimated by your own family, you will want to hear what happened next. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, in a small two-bedroom house that always felt too crowded even when no one was speaking. My earliest memories were of the sound of rain tapping the window and my mother, Linda, softly humming in the kitchen, trying to keep the peace in a home that rarely had any. She remarried when I was 6. His name was Mark Carver, a former Navy enlisted who still wore his old habits like a badge and his temper like a shadow that never stepped out of the doorway. He moved in with boxes of uniforms plaques and a strict idea of what a Carver should be. From the first evening, he looked at me with an expression that was not quite dislike, but a kind of disappointment reserved for someone who did not meet a standard they never agreed to. When he brought Hannah with him, everything shifted so quickly I barely remembered the version of life that existed before. Hannah was 4 years younger than me, but from the moment she entered the house, she became the center gravity. She was the daughter he bragged about, the one he held high, the one he called his future sailor. I became something else entirely. Quiet Mouse. That was the name Mark liked to use. He said it with a half laugh as if it explained everything wrong with me. Riley does not talk much. He would tell neighbors she hides behind her books. Beneath that phrase was an accusation I did not understand until years later. To him, silence was weakness and thinking was useless unless it came with muscles and a uniform. The house developed 2 climates, one warm and bright whenever Hannah did anything as small as tie her shoes correctly, and one cold, sharp, and heavy whenever I walked into a room. Hannah learned quickly how to use it. She loved performing for Mark, and he rewarded her with praise for even the smallest effort. "Look at her," he would say. "Just 8 years old and already tougher than you." Toughness was his favorite measurement. Not kindness, not curiosity, not intelligence, just loudness and physical presence. I remember one evening in 3rd grade when I brought home a math test with a perfect score. I was proud for about 3 seconds. I handed it to Mark, hoping he might say something positive for once, but he glanced at the paper, then tossed it onto the floor as if it were scrap. "Real carvers do not hide behind books, Riley," he said. "A real carver serves the Navy." Even then, I knew he was not really talking about serving. He was talking about obeying him, fitting his mold, living his kind of life. I picked up the paper, quietly smoothing out the creases, while Hannah snickered behind him. She liked to hover near him like a smaller echo, repeating whatever attitude he set. And as the years passed, she learned how to get under my skin with little things. Breaking the spine of my favorite books, borrowing my pencils, then snapping them in half, switching the labels on my school folders, all harmless on the surface, but constant enough that I internalized a lesson I did not fully understand then. Silence is easier than fighting battles no one wants you to win. My mother tried to keep things steady, but she was soft-spoken and afraid of conflict. When she married Mark, she traded her independence for a man who filled the house with rules and expectations she never agreed to but never challenged. She would whisper apologies to me when no one was looking, but apologies could not stop what came next. The moment that changed everything happened on a dim evening in late winter when I was 9. I heard voices rising from the kitchen. I moved down the hallway, quietly standing just out of sight. My mother sounded tired and scared. Mark sounded offended by something small. A bill, a late errand, something that should never have escalated. Then I heard the sound. Not a crash, but a sharp snap of noise that made the whole house freeze. My mother stumbled into view, holding her cheek eyes wide. Not crying, just stunned. And Mark stood over her, breathing hard, insisting she had provoked him, insisting she had made him do it, insisting that this house would run his way or no way. Hannah peeked from behind him and said nothing. Later, she would tell me Mom exaggerates stuff like that, do not get involved. And Mark, he insisted to me that good families stay quiet. That real loyalty means knowing when to look the other way. That night, I learned two things. First, that silence can protect you, but it can also trap you. Second, that justice is not something you wait for. It is something you build, slowly, patiently, quietly, and always in your own time. Those years shaped me in ways Mark never imagined. He thought he was turning me into someone small, someone easy to dismiss. But every ignored accomplishment, every insult, every quiet moment he mistook for weakness became fuel. My mind sharpened instead of dulling. I watched everything, understood everything, learned when to speak and when to wait. I saw how people use power and how quickly they lose it when someone stronger stands silently behind them. People assume your silence means you have no voice. They forget silence can mean calculation, patience, control. They forget silence can be the first step in a very long plan. If you have ever seen a family choose one child over the other, if you have ever watched fairness dissolve under someone else's expectations, then you already know the kind of childhood that builds someone like me. I left home the week after my 18th birthday without a goodbye dinner or a single word of encouragement. Leaving was easier than staying because by then I understood that the Carver household had no place for anyone who did not fit Mark's narrow definition of strength. I packed a single duffel bag with clothes, a folder of school records, and the acceptance form from the Army recruiter. My mother cried quietly near the doorway, trying to hide it from Mark, but he stood behind her with his arms crossed and said the same line he had been repeating for years. "Desk work is not real service, Riley. You will be back in a month." I did not answer him. Silence had become my greatest shield, and I would not break it for a man who never listened in the first place. I boarded the bus alone, and as Tacoma faded from view through the window, I felt something I had never felt in that house. Space, breathing room, a future that belonged to me, and not to the expectations of someone else. Fort Jackson was my first taste of discipline without cruelty. Drill sergeants yelled, but they yelled at everyone equally. They corrected mistakes without humiliation. They pushed us because they wanted us to succeed, not because they needed control. I thrived there in my own quiet way. I did not aim to be the loudest or the strongest. I learned to read people movements and patterns faster than most of my peers. When the time came to choose a specialization, I selected military intelligence without hesitation. The instructors reviewed my test scores, especially the analytical sections, and told me I was heading to Fort Gordon for advanced training. Fort Gordon felt like stepping into a world where my brain finally counted for something. We spent hours breaking down communication systems, learning how to track signals through layers of interference, understanding the language of electronic warfare. Target mapping came naturally to me. While others struggled to connect small clues into a cohesive picture, I could see the entire structure forming in my mind. It felt like breathing. I was not loud about it, but the instructors noticed. Some people excel by proving themselves through force. I excelled by seeing patterns nobody else saw. By the end of the first month, my instructors requested a private evaluation. I walked into the small office unsure what to expect, but they looked at me with the kind of measured curiosity that made my skin tighten. One of them tapped a folder on the desk and said, "Riley, you scored in the top 1% on analytical reasoning. You also scored unusually high on crisis calm. That combination is rare." I nodded, not knowing what to say. Another instructor leaned forward. "There is a selection program. It is not quite JSOC. More like a pre-screening for individuals who might be eligible someday. Your profile fits. You will not be told everything. But you should know this is not about pushing papers. It is about making decisions that affect people on the ground." Their words stayed with me. For the first time in my life, someone was telling me that my quiet nature was not weakness. It was capability. It was control. I accepted the offer without hesitation. Of course, I called home to share the news, even though I knew how it would be received. Hannah answered on the second ring. She sounded older, more confident, carrying that tone she had adopted from Mark. Before I could explain anything, she started talking about her own path. "I just started SEAL training prep," she said. "Not the official pipeline yet, but they selected me. Real battlefield work, you know, not sitting at a desk decoding things." I could almost hear her smirk. When I told her about the pre-JSOC program, she paused only long enough to dismiss it. That stuff is not real combat, Riley. It is admin work with clearance stickers. Then she laughed. Maybe someday you will do something impressive. I knew arguing would be pointless. It always was. Hannah believed physical dominance was the only version of success that mattered. She believed Mark's words the way some people believe scripture. So I let her talk. I let her monologue about obstacle courses and drown-proofing drills and how instructors told her she had the mindset to survive Hell Week someday. None of it bothered me. Not anymore. Because for the first time I was on my own path. A path that did not require me to prove anything to her or to Mark. I ended the call with a simple good luck. Not sarcasm, just honesty, because I had finally figured out something important. People like Hannah throw their accomplishments in others' faces because they are terrified of being overlooked. People like me do not need to do that. We build our reputations slowly, quietly, and with precision. A few weeks into the screening program, I received my first classified assignment simulation and completed it faster than anyone else in the group. The instructors watched me with that same look of measured approval I had seen earlier. For years, I had survived by staying quiet. Now that same silence was becoming my advantage. If you have ever broken away from a family that never believed in you, then you know exactly how powerful that first step into your own future feels. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope with no return address and no markings except a short line instructing me to report to Fort Bragg within 72 hours. There was no signature, no explanation, just coordinates and a time. Most soldiers would have been confused or even concerned, but the instructors at Fort Gordon had prepared me for this moment without saying a single direct word. Programs like the one they hinted at never advertised themselves. They found you only if you fit a profile the government needed. When I stepped off the transport shuttle in North Carolina, the air felt heavier than the West Coast air I grew up with. Thicker, warmer. The base had recently expanded its secure facilities, and there was a tension in the atmosphere that made every footstep echo like it carried classified weight. A staff sergeant met me on the tarmac, checked my name, then walked me directly to a nondescript building at the edge of the installation. There were no signs, no unit designation, just a reinforced door that opened only after a retinal scan and a moment of silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. Inside, a colonel with silver hair and calm eyes introduced himself simply as Director Hale. He did not offer his first name. He did not ask mine. He just studied me for a long moment and nodded as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Riley, you are here because you scored off the charts in analytical cohesion and crisis stability," he said, "and because you understand how to remain silent until it is time to speak." That is a rare trait. He did not oversell anything. He did not try to intimidate me. Instead, he pushed a thin folder across the table. On the front was a small emblem I had never seen before, a jagged vector shape without text. Inside the folder was one sentence, Ghost Vector Program. I looked up at him. He waited. "You will not ask what it stands for," he said. "You will not ask who oversees it. You will not ask how many people are in it. You will do the work, and you will disappear from every roster that has your name on it." The training was unlike anything I had experienced. It took place in windowless rooms underground far from the noise of the main base. The days were long and structured with a precision that eliminated any illusion of routine. Psychological operations training came first. We learned how people respond under pressure, how to read micro-expressions, how to shift a conversation without the other person noticing. It was like learning a new language. Then came deep cover intelligence conditioning. Weeks spent in simulations where we had to assume identities, build believable backstories, and maintain those stories under questioning from retired interrogators who had decades of experience detecting lies. I learned to control my pulse, my breathing, even the way I blinked. It was not about deception, it was about mastery. After that came mission command simulations where I stood in dark rooms surrounded by screens feeding orders to operators in real time. These drills were built to mimic Tier 1 missions. I had to monitor signals, make snap decisions, and coordinate moving parts that could go off course at any second. The instructors watched without speaking, and I knew every mistake counted. Slowly, the picture became clear. My supposed desk job was a facade. I was not being trained to support missions. I was being trained to guide them, to steer entire operations from the shadows. The Ghost Vector program operated where there were no headlines, no uniforms, no recognition. It was the kind of work where success meant you stayed invisible forever. I adapted to it the way I had adapted to everything else in my life. Quietly, precisely, without ego. Weeks passed, then months. I learned things that would never appear in my service record. I met people who would never admit they worked in the building. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Not because someone allowed it, but because I had earned it. My family knew none of this. To them, I was still the quiet girl who hid behind books, a desk analyst, an administrative footnote. Hannah especially enjoyed reminding me. She called one afternoon during my brief window of permitted communication. I could hear the pride dripping from her voice before she even spoke. "Guess who made it through Hell Week," she said. "Well, not official graduation, but they said I have the grit. Real field work, Riley. Real danger. Not typing reports." I let her talk. I let her paint herself as the symbol of Carver's strength. She never realized I was standing in a classified facility where entire operations rested on whether I could keep my mind steady. She never realized I had already passed tests far more demanding than anything she imagined, but I did not correct her. I did not try to outshine her. Silence was still my ally, and the truth would reveal itself in time. If you have ever been underestimated so deeply that even your accomplishments were dismissed, then you already understand why I stayed quiet. Some truths only matter when they are revealed in the right moment. By 2022, I had been with the Ghost Vector program long enough to forget what ordinary military life felt like. My world had become a rotation of sealed rooms, encrypted briefings, satellite feeds, and decisions that moved quietly across continents without leaving a signature. Most of the time, I directed missions from the command cell, guiding operators who never saw my face and who only knew me by a call sign chosen to erase the person behind it. But the mission in Hasaka changed everything. It was supposed to be a clean extraction, the kind of operation we had rehearsed 100 times. A small group of American contractors had been taken hostage by a militia splinter cell operating near the Syrian border. The team on the ground needed real-time intelligence signal tracing and route analysis to get the hostages out before they were moved deeper into hostile territory. I was assigned as mission lead from the secure facility. My job was to track communications traffic map enemy movements and guide the operators toward the compound without triggering an alarm. For the first several hours, everything moved with precision. The satellite feed aligned with the UAV overhead. The thermal mapping confirmed the hostages were inside a single structure. The team moved in quiet arcs of discipline through infrared night. Then the UAV feed flickered, a half-second glitch. At first, I thought it was atmospheric interference. Then the picture shifted again, and a foreign signature appeared in the telemetry. Someone had accessed our UAV. Not enough to fly it or redirect it, but enough to scramble the feed. Enough to warn someone on the ground that they were being watched. It was not random, it was deliberate, and it meant the team was walking into a trap without knowing it. I felt my pulse stay steady even as the room tightened around me. Director Hale stepped behind my shoulder reading the same data. His voice was calm but final. "We cannot lose the team. We cannot lose the hostages." The only way to correct the breach was to break protocol and replace the compromised equipment manually. Someone had to go forward. Someone who understood both the system and the field. Someone who could move quietly enough to avoid detection. Hale looked at me. I already knew what he was going to ask. "You can refuse," he said. It was the only time in my career someone in that building had used those words. I told him I would go. They prepared a disguise that erased my rank and identity. I boarded a transport under the cover of night and landed near the Syrian border with a small group of local assets who knew only that I was an analyst sent to correct a technical issue. They did not know my name. They did not need to. I moved with them through narrow alleys and abandoned buildings until we reached a vantage point overlooking the compound. The hacked device was not far. I crawled to it through dust and shadow, reconnected the lines manually, and rerouted the signal back through a secondary channel the militia could not detect. When the feed stabilized, I saw the operators exactly where they should be seconds away from breaching the door. The hostages were alive, frightened but unharmed. The team moved with practiced speed and discipline. Within minutes, the hostages were free and the extraction began. It was clean, efficient, and it would have ended there if not for the explosion. Not from the operators, not from the hostages, from behind me. A stray mortar fired in the chaos of retreating militia hit the building I was using to shield myself. The blast threw dust and debris into the air. I hit the ground hard but conscious. When I radioed the command cell to confirm the mission was complete, Hale answered not with relief but with a tone I had never heard from him. "Riley, your signal is compromised. We cannot pull you out without risking exposure of the program." And then came the sentence that would define the next chapter of my life. "We are marking you KIA until further notice." KIA, killed in action. My name, my rank, my existence. All of it erased in seconds because the mission required it. I stayed hidden until a small transport team moved me to a safe house miles away. From there, I was transferred under a false identity to a covert facility where no one knew me except Hale and 2 other officers cleared to handle personnel losses inside Ghost Vector. They told me the truth. The UAV hack had been deliberate. Someone with clearance and access to encrypted systems had triggered the breach. Someone from inside. Until they found the source, I had to remain off record. No calls, no messages, no signs of life. They would not risk the leak escalating. 9 months passed like that. I slept in a windowless room. I trained in short intervals. I waited for updates that never came. When the official report went out saying I had died in Syria, my family did not hold a memorial. They did not call the army for details. They did not ask where my remains were. The only real reaction came from Hannah, who told a relative that I probably died behind a laptop doing something unimportant. Hearing that secondhand did not break me. It clarified everything I had always known. Some people only understand your value when it is too late to apologize. If you have ever been written off by your own family, you know how powerful it feels when the truth comes back louder than their doubt. When the orders finally came, they arrived with the same cold efficiency as the letter that had first sent me to Fort Bragg. No explanations, no condolences, no recognition of the 9 months I had spent in silence. Just a single line stamped across the encrypted document instructing me to report to Joint Base Lewis McChord for reintegration under temporary low-profile status. Low profile was the polite way of saying I had to walk onto the base pretending to be someone far beneath my real position, someone junior, someone unnoticed, someone who had no connection to Ghost Vector and no authority beyond a standard intel assignment. It was necessary. The leak that had compromised our mission in Syria was still unidentified. Until JSOC confirmed who had accessed the UAV data, my presence had to be hidden beneath a layer of paperwork and misdirection thick enough that no one would suspect I had ever done more than sift through reports. Returning to a base where people thought I had died was an unsettling sensation. Walking through the secure gates, knowing my name had been removed from every roster, was stranger still. I stepped onto the pavement feeling like a shadow of myself, alive but ghosted by bureaucracy, present but invisible by design. A liaison officer met me with a neutral expression and escorted me to a temporary barracks room at the far end of the installation. He never asked a question. He never used my rank. He addressed me with a generic title that matched the cover file I had been assigned. I understood the protocol. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer the investigation would be. But understanding did not remove the weight of walking past soldiers who had no idea the person they saw had once guided missions that shaped headlines they would never read. I barely had time to settle before I learned something that made my pulse shift. A SEAL team was rotating through JBLM for joint training, and in that team was Hannah, my stepsister, the golden child who had spent her entire life using my silence as an excuse to raise her voice. The one person who would never see my return as anything but an opportunity to remind me of my place in the Carver hierarchy. I had not expected to cross paths with her so quickly. I certainly had not expected the moment to unfold in the manner it did. I was walking across the motor pool area early in the morning carrying a stack of reintegration files that masked the equipment I had actually been reviewing. I had been instructed to maintain the appearance of administrative work until my meeting with the JSOC oversight team. The sun was still low, and the fog had not yet lifted when I heard footsteps behind me, followed by a stunned voice that I recognized immediately. "You are alive." Hannah stood there in her training uniform staring at me as if I had crawled out of the ground. Shock hit her first. She looked genuinely startled for a moment, and I saw the calculation behind her eyes. Her expression shifted slowly from disbelief to irritation and then to something closer to annoyance. She recovered quickly, and her voice gained that tone I remembered from childhood, the tone she used when she wanted to show dominance in any room she entered. "Wow," she said, drawing out the word. "I guess even paperwork people can survive overseas if they hide well enough." The SEAL trainees around her snickered softly. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough to remind me how quickly group dynamics form when someone sets the tone. Hannah took another step closer. She tilted her head, studying me the way someone inspects an object they assumed was broken beyond repair. "I thought you were done for," she said. "Honestly, I am surprised you made it through anything real." Her words did not sting. Not the way they would have when I was younger. If anything, they felt familiar, like a sound from a past life I no longer lived in. I held the file in my hands and reminded myself that the protocol required silence. My cover story depended on it. So I did not react, not visibly, not verbally. And silence in the face of someone like Hannah never sat well. She wanted a rise. She wanted validation for her assumptions. When she did not get it, she laughed lightly as if I had proven her right. "Do not worry," she said. "Some people are meant for the field, some are meant for screens. Nothing wrong with that." It was her version of generosity. Condescending but coated with enough false sweetness to make her feel superior. I met her eyes for a second. Not long enough to challenge her. Just long enough to see what she could not hide. Even through her dismissal, she was studying me with a faint note of confusion. Something about my posture. Something about my calm. Something she could not place. She shook it off quickly and turned back to her team. The humiliation she tried to build did not land with the force she expected. Not because she had softened, but because I had changed. She was speaking to the version of me she remembered, not the version of me standing in front of her. I walked away without a word. The protocol demanded it. The mission demanded it. But inside me, something old and sharp flickered awake. The same feeling I had the first time Mark threw my achievements to the floor. The same feeling that had carried me through Fort Gordon and Fort Bragg. The same feeling that had kept me alive in Hasaka. A quiet promise. A controlled heat. A certainty that truth has a way of rising no matter how hard people try to bury it. If you have ever returned to a place where everyone believed they understood you only to realize they never knew you at all, then you understand what that morning felt like. By the second morning at JBLM, I had already settled into the rhythm of the cover identity the reintegration protocol required. I walked where I was told to walk. I carried folders that held nothing but blank forms. I reviewed equipment logs that were deliberately outdated. Everything about my presence was constructed to leave the impression of a low-clearance analyst who had recently rotated in from a stateside assignment. My true role was buried under layers of misdirection thick enough that even seasoned personnel would have no reason to suspect anything different. But the problem with walking quietly through a military base is that your silence creates a vacuum. And people like Hannah rush to fill that vacuum with whatever narrative gives them the most attention. I saw it happening in real time. The small glances from young soldiers, the half-hidden curiosity, the whispered questions about who I was and whether I had done anything meaningful overseas. They knew nothing about me, but Hannah made sure she controlled the version of me they heard first. I was crossing the training yard just before noon when I noticed a small group of new arrivals gathered near the obstacle course. Their uniforms were crisp. Their faces still carried the alertness of people who had not yet been worn down by the grind of daily operations. They stood in a semicircle around Hannah, who was pacing in front of them like an instructor giving an informal motivational talk. I recognized the posture, the confidence, the slight arch in her voice meant to project authority. She had always loved being the center of attention. The young soldiers listened closely as she spoke about field training, team coordination, and the mindset required for special operations. Then one of them pointed discreetly toward me. I kept walking, pretending not to hear. But Hannah saw the opportunity immediately. She glanced my way, smirked, and said loud enough for everyone within 30 feet to catch it. "She is just intel paperwork. Nothing wrong with it, but it is not field work, not real deployment." She said it with the tone someone uses when they try to soften an insult by pretending it is a compliment. The young soldiers laughed in that awkward way people do when they are unsure, but do not want to contradict the highest-ranking person in the group. Hannah continued without missing a beat. "Some people like that kind of job," she said. "Screens, reports, sitting safe. Others are built for the field, built for operations, built for more." The way she said more carried the same old implication she had been repeating since childhood. She was implying a hierarchy. She was placing herself at the top of it. She was placing me at the bottom. Her teammates nodded along because they had no reason to believe otherwise. To them, she was a SEAL pipeline candidate, a high performer, a name that carried promise. To them, I was a quiet, low-rank analyst who had returned to base without any visible scars or medals or markers of significant deployment. They laughed because it was easy, because group dynamics reward anyone who reinforces the loudest voice in the room. And I stood there, hearing every word, knowing that none of them would ever imagine the truth behind my silence. I knew the protocol. I knew the stakes. If I defended myself even slightly, I would risk exposing the reintegration cover. If I corrected her even with the barest hint of fact, I would risk compromising the entire investigation into the leak that had cost American lives and nearly cost mine. So I did what the mission required. I kept walking. I held the file close to my chest. I did not turn around. I did not react. And that was what unsettled Hannah more than any argument would have. She expected me to shrink. She expected the humiliation to register. When it did not, when I simply moved forward with the same calm that had carried me through nights in war zones, she would never understand. She faltered. Only for a second. But I saw it. A flicker of confusion. A brief hesitation where her voice dipped the slightest bit before she picked it up again. That was the moment that told me everything had begun shifting. Not publicly, not visibly, not yet. But the foundation beneath her confidence had already started to crack. Quiet strength carries a weight people underestimate until the moment it is too late to recalibrate. I reached the edge of the motor pool and paused to adjust the folder in my hands as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. My heart was steady, my breath controlled. Years of operating behind screens and signals had taught me how to remain a still point in chaos. Years before that had prepared me even better. Growing up in the Carver household meant learning how to absorb humiliation without letting it imprint on your psyche. It meant learning how to stay composed in front of people who weaponized every word. It meant learning that silence is sometimes the most powerful answer. And then the air changed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. A thrum began in the distance, low and resonant enough that you felt it before you heard it. Conversations around the yard stopped mid-sentence. Heads tilted upward. The steady chop of rotor blades grew louder, cutting through the mist like something out of a different world. The UH-60 Blackhawk appeared overhead, descending toward the landing zone behind the motor pool. Dust spiraled. Gravel lifted. Soldiers instinctively stepped back to clear the path. What had started as a moment of casual mockery dissolved instantly into a scene pulled from the highest levels of command operations. And Hannah, who had been so sure of her footing seconds earlier, stood frozen, with her mouth slightly open as the helicopter settled and the doors opened. Whatever narrative she thought she controlled evaporated under the weight of reality. If you have ever held your ground while someone tried to diminish you, trusting that the truth would eventually reveal itself, then you know exactly what that moment meant. The Blackhawk settled onto the landing zone with a force that seemed to shift the entire rhythm of the base. Dust rolled across the pavement in tight spirals. Conversations died mid-word. Even the clatter of tools from the maintenance shed faded as if the whole installation had instinctively held its breath. Helicopters landed at JBLM all the time, but not like this. Not with this kind of presence. Not with 4 generals stepping out as if every second of their arrival carried purpose. I stood near the edge of the motor pool trying to maintain the neutral posture required of my low-profile assignment. My hands stayed loose at my sides, my shoulders relaxed, my breathing measured. But inside the stillness, I could feel every detail sharpening into focus. General Bishop was the first to emerge, tall, silver hair clipped close, eyes steady with the kind of clarity you only see in someone who has spent decades making decisions that determine whether others live or die. Behind him came Lieutenant General Harmon, stiff and imposing at nearly 60. Major General Ruiz followed, scanning the area with a vigilance that never dulled. Brigadier General Avery stepped out last, moving with calm precision. Soldiers all around me froze. A few straightened their uniforms instinctively. Others whispered names under their breath, unsure whether to stand at attention or keep still since no formal formation had been called. Hannah, who just moments earlier had been performing her routine of condescension for an audience of new soldiers, fell completely silent. Her smirk died so quickly it looked like someone had wiped it off her face with one motion. I did not turn to watch her reaction directly, but I sensed it. The sudden shift in her breathing, the tightening in her stance, the realization that something important was unfolding right in front of her and she did not understand her place in it. The generals did not greet the base personnel. They did not pause to acknowledge the SEAL team nearby. They did not take in the scenery or exchange small talk or wait for an escort. They walked in a straight line with synchronized steps headed directly toward me, not toward the officers gathered near the command building, not toward the ranking NCO supervising the trainees. Toward me, the quiet analyst with a stack of meaningless papers in hand. A hush rolled through the yard. It was the kind of hush that only happens when 100 people reach the same thought at the same time. Something is wrong with this picture. Something does not add up. Something is about to change. The 4 generals stopped a few feet in front of me, forming a line. Dust settled around their boots. I kept my eyes forward, held my cover posture for one more second, then lifted my chin the precise amount protocol had taught me when being addressed by senior command. General Bishop stepped closer. He studied me not with shock or relief, but with the heavy recognition of someone welcoming back a soldier who had walked through fire. His voice carried across the motor pool with quiet authority. "Major Carver, welcome back." The words hit the ground like a seismic wave. Every soldier who heard them reacted the same way. A flicker of disbelief, a tightening of posture, a silent calculation as they tried to connect the title to the woman standing quietly in front of them. Behind me, I heard a sharp inhale. Hannah. She must have gone completely still in that moment because no sound followed, no movement, no denial, just the sudden collapse of an entire narrative she had built around me. A low murmur spread across the yard. Officers stepped back instinctively. Enlisted soldiers glanced at one another with wide eyes. Even the SEAL trainees, who rarely looked impressed by anything, straightened as if struck by the realization that they had misread the entire situation. And then the generals saluted. All 4 of them. At once. Perfect timing. Perfect form. A salute meant for one person, and only one. I returned it with steady precision. When I lowered my hand, they lowered theirs, each movement echoing across the pavement with symbolic weight that none of them needed to explain. The exposure was complete. Whatever Hannah had told the trainees no longer mattered. Whatever assumptions the base had formed about me dissolved under the clarity of military protocol. 4 generals do not salute a low-rank analyst. 4 generals do not walk across a yard in coordinated silence for someone who files reports. 4 generals do not acknowledge a soldier like that unless that soldier has done something few people will ever hear about, but everyone would respect if they knew. The moment stretched long enough for the watching crowd to fully absorb it, long enough for the humiliation to settle on the person who had crafted it only minutes earlier, long enough for the truth to rise without a single word of explanation. When the salute ended, General Bishop leaned in slightly and lowered his voice so that only I could hear him. "Report to the secured briefing room in 1 hour. Reintegration Phase 2 begins now." I nodded once, acknowledging the order. He stepped back. The generals turned in unison and walked toward the command building, leaving behind a silence that felt charged like a storm cloud resisting the break of thunder. I did not turn to look at Hannah. I did not need to. I could feel the weight of her stunned realization like a sharp shift in air pressure behind me. The soldiers who had laughed earlier stood unmoving, unsure whether to speak or not. I walked away calmly, each step measured the same way I had moved through villages in Syria, each breath steady with the same discipline that had kept me alive. If you have ever been underestimated long enough that the truth becomes its own kind of justice, then you understand what it felt like to have an entire base witness the moment your silence finally spoke for itself. By the afternoon, the base no longer felt like the same place I had walked into that morning. Something intangible but unmistakable had shifted. Soldiers who normally kept their heads down now glanced at me with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Conversations paused whenever I passed by. Doors opened a second faster. Salutes came a second sharper. It was never dramatic or loud. It was the quiet ripple effect that happens when hierarchy suddenly rearranges itself in front of an entire installation. I had not said a single word to explain anything, and yet the question hung everywhere I walked. Who is she? The motor pool had witnessed the moment, but the story spread far beyond it. By the time I reached the admin building, small groups were already whispering near the corridors. Some tried to be discreet, while others gave up pretending. I caught fragments as I passed. 4 generals. At once. That never happens. Someone else said I heard Bishop say, Major. Major who? A few NCOs speculated quietly about whether I had come from a special operations unit. Others wondered if I had transferred from an intel post at the Pentagon. Rumors gained shape faster than facts ever could. I kept my expression calm and unreadable. The reintegration protocol required it. The investigation required it. And more importantly, I had lived my whole life being watched by people who misunderstood me. Silence was not difficult. Silence was familiar. The reactions from the SEAL rotation team were the most revealing. Young operators who had laughed at Hannah's comments earlier now kept their distance, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. They were trained to read situations quickly. They knew a power imbalance when they saw one collapse in front of them. One of them approached Hannah near the training equipment and asked the question everyone else had been thinking. Why did you treat a major like that? His tone was not confrontational. It was confused, practical, logical. Hannah tried to recover, tried to laugh it off, tried to say she had no idea I outranked her, tried to frame her earlier comments as casual banter. But even from across the yard, I could see the panic building beneath her controlled expression. She had always been confident in every room she walked into. She had always assumed she controlled the narrative. But this time, she was trapped by her own certainty. Her teammates questioned her again. Why would 4 generals salute her? Why would Bishop greet her personally? Why would a supposed low-rank analyst walk with that kind of quiet posture reserved for people who had seen more than most? Hannah did not have an answer. She only had excuses. And excuses collapse quickly when faced with facts unfolding in plain sight. She kept glancing in my direction as if hoping I would rescue her from the questions or confirm her story or at least acknowledge her in a way that softened the sting. I did none of those things. That was never my role, and she had never earned that relief. I continued on to the secure building for my reintegration debrief, and every soldier I passed stepped aside instinctively, not because they recognized me, but because they recognized something had changed. Respect is a strange thing. It cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. It reveals itself naturally in the smallest gestures. And fear is not the opposite of respect. Indifference is. For years, my family had treated me with indifference so deep it felt like erasure. Here at JBLM, I saw the difference instantly. People who had doubted me hours earlier now hesitated before forming opinions. People who had seen Hannah's performance now questioned her judgment instead of mine. Truth moves quietly but efficiently. The reintegration session with the JSOC oversight team took an hour. They confirmed my next tasks. I confirmed my readiness. When I stepped back outside, the sun had started to set behind the tree line, leaving a pale, golden light across the airfield. That was when my phone buzzed. I expected a message from the liaison or an update from Director Hale. Instead, it was a number I had not seen in nearly a year but knew instantly. Mark Carver, my stepfather. The man who had dismissed every achievement I ever brought home. The man who had spent years calling me quiet mouse and telling me a real Carver only mattered if they wore a Navy uniform. I answered because I knew what the reintegration protocol required. The moment I said hello, his voice cut through the line tense and irritated as if my survival had somehow inconvenienced him. "So you are alive," he said. "No relief, no concern, just accusation." I kept my tone neutral. "Yes, I am back on base," he scoffed. "I heard something happened, something about officers showing up. People are saying things. What did you do, Riley? Not congratulations, not curiosity for my safety." He wanted control, always control. I felt none of the old pressure rise in me. Instead, I felt distance, clarity. He continued, "Do not embarrass the family. Hannah has a reputation here. Do not interfere with that." The irony was almost too sharp to ignore. For years, they had treated my existence as an inconvenience. Now that my presence tangled with Hannah's image, they suddenly cared. But I kept my tone steady. "I am focused on my duty, Mark. Nothing more." He did not like that answer. He said something about loyalty and family image before hanging up without waiting for my reply. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and exhaled slowly. It was strange how the people who underestimated you the longest were always the ones who panicked first when the truth finally surfaced. I walked back across the base as the daylight dimmed, knowing that this was only the beginning. If you have ever watched people rewrite their behavior out of confusion and fear when they realize they misjudged you, then you understand what the whispers at JBLM felt like. The day after the salute, the base finally regained its noise, but the atmosphere had changed. Eyes followed me differently, not with suspicion, but with calculation, as if people were trying to reconcile the image they had been fed with what they had witnessed. If the rumors had been loud before, the silence that followed them was louder still. That silence created space for the real work to begin. The investigation. The reason JSOC had pulled me out of declared death and placed me back on a base where the leak might still be active. My first briefing with the oversight team was held in a secured room beneath the command building. No windows. No personal devices. 3 officers sat across from me behind a table. One of them slid a folder forward. UAV breach, Syria, Hasaka. This was not a review. It was a hunt. A slow, silent extraction of truth. I opened the folder and scanned the first page. The telemetry logs confirmed everything I remembered from the night the UAV feed had flickered. A foreign signature, not brute force, not random. It was a subtle, permissions-based intrusion that required knowledge of our system architecture. An outsider could not have done it. This was someone inside the network, someone with access to at least mid-level encryption keys, and someone who knew exactly when to strike. We had already eliminated external intelligence agencies. Their patterns didn't match this intrusion. Instead, the breach point intersected with a cluster of devices belonging to rotational elements at JBLM. The oversight officer tapped a finger on a highlighted section. "This is where we think the breach originated." My stomach tightened. I recognized the designation. It belonged to the SEAL rotation team, the same team Hannah had arrived with. The officer continued. "The time frame aligns with a contractor group they interacted with before deployment. We believe someone provided access for money, or influence, or both." I kept my expression neutral, but the weight of that possibility settled heavily inside me. It was not enough to confirm guilt. It was enough to open a door. After the briefing, I spent several hours analyzing encrypted logs and cross-referencing comms data. I moved through the information the same way I moved through a battlefield route, quietly, steadily, with deliberate precision. My mind slipped back into the rhythm it had maintained during black site missions. Detached focus, pattern detection, composure, even when data pointed toward uncomfortable truths. And the more I traced the digital footprints, the more the pieces aligned toward one ugly implication. Someone on the SEAL rotation had engaged in unauthorized communication with a private defense contractor group that had already been flagged twice for suspicious activities overseas, and the communicator had used a device that matched the type assigned to Hannah's training cluster. The realization did not hit me with shock. It hit me with something colder, something steadier. Because in some part of me that I never said aloud, I had always suspected that Hannah, for all her bravado, carried a recklessness she mistook for courage. Recklessness can be dangerous in special operations, not just to oneself, but to everyone around. Still, suspicion was not proof, and proof was the only thing I was allowed to move on. I sat alone in the secured room, reviewing the message logs. Short bursts of coded exchanges. Contact with a contractor known for buying low-level access to test system vulnerabilities, and Hannah's device signature appeared not once but 3 times connected to encrypted outgoing transmissions. It could have been an accident, a misclick, a shared access point. The logical part of my mind reviewed every alternate explanation, weighing each possibility carefully. The emotional part, the part shaped by years of being dismissed, undermined, and used, whispered another narrative. This is how she always operates: careless, entitled, certain nothing she does has consequences. I let the emotion surface for a moment, but only a moment. Then I pushed it back down. The mission came first. Justice over revenge, duty over personal satisfaction. That was the rule I had lived by long before JSOC noticed me. I requested movement permissions to conduct interviews with certain personnel. My cover identity allowed me to ask without raising suspicion. Most of the SEAL team answered easily, but one detail repeated itself enough times to raise the internal alarm. Hannah had been the point of contact for a contractor who offered to optimize device settings before the Syria deployment. Several teammates brushed it off as a favor she had accepted because she liked the attention. Others hinted she had been bragging about connections that would boost her visibility. In special operations, that kind of behavior is not ambition. It is danger disguised as initiative. I took careful notes. I kept my tone even. But I could feel the tension building inside me like a slow, turning weight. When the interviews ended, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. JBLM was quiet, bathed in the last traces of sunset. The sky glowed orange behind the tree line, but the calm did nothing to settle the conflict inside me. The investigation was leading me directly toward someone whose absence in my life had once felt like a relief. Someone who had survived her entire life by believing that consequences were for other people. Someone who had tormented me for years with the conviction that she was strong and I was weak. And now the evidence suggested she had played a role in the breach that nearly killed me and almost cost American lives. My hands tightened at my sides, because if the evidence continued pointing where it was pointing, then the path ahead would require me to choose between personal vindication and impartial justice. And the truth was, I was not sure which part of me would hurt more. The part that wanted her held accountable, or the part that still wished she had never been involved at all. If you have ever found yourself standing between the desire for justice and the fear of what justice might expose, then you understand the gravity of what I faced as the sun set over JBLM that night. I drove back to Tacoma on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of Pacific Northwest day where the sky seemed permanently half asleep. Reintegration protocol allowed limited off-base travel if it did not interfere with the investigation, and after days of reviewing logs and transcripts, I needed distance, physical distance from JBLM and from the tightening circle of suspicion surrounding Hannah. The closer I got to Tacoma, the heavier the air felt. The streets were familiar, but familiarity had never brought comfort. My childhood home sat exactly where I had left it, a faded blue siding, a cracked driveway, and the same dead patch of grass that had been there for 20 years. When I stepped out of the car, the neighborhood felt quieter than I remembered. Maybe it was the fog. Maybe it was the memories. Maybe it was the realization that I had been declared dead less than a year ago and no one inside this house had bothered to question it. I knocked once. The door opened part way, then all the way, revealing my mother standing in the hallway, wearing the same soft sweater she always wore on weekends. Her eyes widened with the same mix of relief and guilt I had seen the day I left for the army. "Riley," she whispered, her voice breaking around the edges. You're really here. I hugged her gently, feeling her shoulders tremble beneath my hands. She stepped back to take in the sight of me brushing a loose strand of hair from my forehead like she used to when I was a child. Come inside, she said quickly, almost anxiously. Please. I walked in, and before she could close the door, another voice drifted from the living room. So the ghost finally shows up. Mark. He sat in his recliner legs, stretched out a can of beer balanced on the armrest. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He didn't look relieved to see me alive. He grunted. You could have called, he said. Would have saved us the trouble of explaining things to neighbors. My mother shot him a look. Mark! What? He snapped. She disappears, then resurfaces. Doesn't even think to give her family a warning. My jaw tightened, but I kept my tone calm. I wasn't permitted to contact anyone. He snorted. Convenient. My mother touched my arm again. Ignore him. He's just saying what everyone else is wondering. Mark cut in. What exactly did you do over there, Riley? How does someone come back from dead paperwork? Dead paperwork. Not death, not sacrifice, not danger. Paperwork. The same dismissal he had used my entire life recycled without hesitation. Before I could reply, footsteps came down the stairs. Hannah. She descended with the kind of practiced confidence she carried everywhere on base. She stopped halfway down, took one look at me, and raised her eyebrows with mocking surprise. Well, look at that, she said. You really are alive. She walked the rest of the way down slowly, deliberately, like she was giving herself time to choose the best angle for humiliation. I thought your kind of job kept you safe enough. Guess not. Hannah, my mother warned, but Hannah only smiled. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. So, she said, how does it feel to almost die doing… What exactly? Sorting intel files. Checking satellite spreadsheets. Mark chuckled. My mother closed her eyes briefly as if bracing for impact. You don't have to talk like that, she said softly. Hannah ignored her. You know Hannah said real deployments are different. Not everyone can handle it. But hey, you lasted longer than I expected. I watched her carefully, not because the words hurt, they didn't. Not anymore. But because something in her tone didn't match her expression. She wasn't just trying to insult me, she was covering something, overcompensating, pushing attention anywhere but toward herself. You've been busy, I said evenly. SEAL rotation at JBLM. Contractors on the side. Extra device testing sessions. Her eyes flickered just a fraction but enough. Enough to confirm what the logs had already shown. What are you implying? She demanded. Nothing I said. Yet. Mark slammed his foot down on the floor. Do not bring your military accusations into this house. Hannah works hard. She's doing real service. Not whatever classified nonsense you pretend to do. Pretend. That word settled over the room like a poisonous fog. My mother pressed a hand to her forehead. Please, she whispered. Can we not fight? Riley just got here? She's the one starting it, Hannah snapped, walking in here like she's above us. I stepped toward her, not aggressively, just enough to close the distance by a single deliberate footstep. That alone was enough for her to stiffen because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what she was standing in front of. She wasn't sure she understood me. She wasn't sure she ever had. Hannah, I said quietly, you have absolutely no idea who you're speaking to. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was truth, clear, controlled, sharp enough to cut, but steady enough to stay professional. Hannah blinked twice. Mark stopped mid-breath. Even my mother froze. The silence that followed was heavy and electric, the kind of silence that shifts the atmosphere in a room. Because it wasn't just about rank or authority, it was about the fact that for the first time in our lives, I wasn't the one shrinking. I wasn't the quiet mouse. I wasn't the one absorbing punches to keep peace that had never existed. I was standing squarely in my identity, and they had no idea how to respond. Hannah recovered first, though poorly. She tossed her hair back and scoffed. Don't talk in riddles, Riley. If you have something to say it. I will, I replied, when protocol allows. Her jaw flexed. She didn't understand the sentence, but she understood enough to be unsettled. Mark shook his head. This is exactly what I mean. Pretending you're important. Talking in code like you matter more than the rest of us. I looked at him steadily. I don't need to pretend. His face reddened. My mother touched his arm, pleading silently for him to stop. He pulled away from her hand. No, he said. She needs to hear this. You walk in here with no explanation. You think surviving something makes you special. Hannah is the one who's going to make this family proud. She's the one who's doing real service. She's the one who might also be responsible for leaking classified information overseas, I said quietly. The room went still. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Mark looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. What did you just say? He demanded. Nothing I can discuss further, I replied. Not here, not yet. Hannah stepped forward now, trying to look angry, but the fear beneath her expression was unmistakable. You don't know anything. You're bluffing. Maybe I said, we'll see. My mother suddenly whispered, Riley, is this true, Hannah? Did you? No, Hannah snapped. She's twisting things because she's jealous. Jealous, I repeated, tilting my head slightly. I spent the last 9 months erased from existence because of a breach. If I were jealous of anything, it would be the luxury of ignorance. The sentence landed exactly the way I intended. Not loud, not cruel, just factual. And facts were more devastating than insults. I glanced between them all, then stepped toward the door. I came here to see Mom, I said calmly. Not to argue. When this investigation concludes, you'll know the truth. All of you. My mother looked torn, terrified of what the truth might be. Mark looked furious, terrified of losing control. Hannah looked exposed, terrified in a way she didn't yet know how to name. As I stepped outside, the cold Tacoma air hit my face and I exhaled slowly. If you've ever stood in the doorway of the house that once defined you and realized you've outgrown every inch of it, then you know exactly what I felt walking back to my car that evening and why none of them knew that the storm had only just begun. By Monday morning, the investigation had shifted from a slow-burning process to something sharper, something with edges. Director Hale summoned me before dawn, and when I entered the secured briefing room beneath the command building, I could tell immediately that something had changed. 3 members of the oversight team were already seated. A 4th chair, usually left empty, was pulled forward, a sign that today would not be routine. Hale gestured for me to sit. Carver, he said quietly, we have movement. He slid a thick folder across the table. Not digital, not encrypted. Physical pages. That alone told me whatever lay inside was sensitive enough that no system could store it without risk. I opened it, and the first page hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not emotionally, professionally. A time-stamped record of unauthorized encrypted file transfers routed through an account flagged by the FBI 2 years earlier during a separate investigation into defense contracting fraud. The second page listed the device that originated the transfer, a device assigned to SEAL Rotation Cluster Bravo, and more specifically to Hannah Carver. I felt my body stay perfectly still, not tense, not rigid, just still the way I had been trained. My pulse remained steady, though it echoed faintly in the back of my skull. Hale watched me carefully. We believe your stepsister initiated the communication, he said. Possibly unintentionally. Possibly not? Explain, I said, my voice level. The lead oversight officer stood and walked to the wall screen. He tapped it, illuminating a sequence of charts and network diagrams. During the contractor meetup before the Syria deployment, he said one of the civilians gave several trainees a software package marketed as an optimization tool. It was actually a tunneling protocol. It allowed low-level access to encrypted systems through relay points disguised as diagnostics. I studied the pattern. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the period before the UAV breach. 3 devices installed the software, he continued. 2 were wiped automatically. 1 wasn't. He pointed to the remaining line. Hannah Carver's. I said nothing. Not yet. The officer clicked the screen again. A new window appeared, a list of outgoing encrypted packets. Short bursts, random intervals, enough to seem harmless, enough to look like system checks. But the content header, the one thing even tunneling cannot fully hide, contained metadata used in UAV keys. Not critical keys, but enough. Enough to create the flicker I saw that night in Syria. Enough to allow the malicious tech specialist to recognize the UAV signature and scramble the feed. Enough to nearly get my team killed. Enough to bury me alive for 9 months. Hale folded his hands. We don't know whether she understood what she was sending, but intent is irrelevant at this phase. Unauthorized transmission of classified metadata is a breach. Punishable, the oversight officer added under UCMJ federal statute and special operations protocol. My eyes dropped back to the folder. On the last page was an image, a still frame, a face blurred to protect the FBI source. A meeting log between that source and an unidentified SEAL trainee. The source had tagged the contact as eager to impress naive susceptible to flattery, excited for opportunities. The note that followed chilled the air around me. Appears desperate to prove worth. Open to bending protocol if it earns recognition. Hale leaned back. Carver, we believe your stepsister is that contact. There it was. The sentence I had known was coming. The sentence that wrapped the last 10 days into one terrible truth. Hannah hadn't just been careless. She had been manipulated, possibly willingly, into giving access to a contractor already under surveillance. And because of that, the UAV had been compromised. Because of that, the mission had been threatened. Because of that, I had been declared dead. I closed the folder. Do you want my reaction? I asked. No. Hale's voice softened. I want your clarity. For a long moment, the room was silent. Not tense, not expectant, just still. Everyone there waiting for the one question only I could answer. Would I handle this as a sister or as a soldier? And truthfully, for a brief moment I didn't know. Logic told me the answer. Duty told me. Everything I had been trained for told me. But the child inside, the one who grew up with Hannah's mockery and Mark's condescension, felt the weight differently. Not with sentiment, not with grief. With something colder. Something like inevitability. Is she under surveillance? I asked. Yes, the officer said. Her communications are being monitored. She has not attempted contact with the contractor again. But we need to formalize the case. You need a report from me, I said. Hale nodded. Protocol requires that the officer most impacted file the initiating memorandum. Given your involvement in Syria, you are that officer. A faint shiver moved through me. Not fear, but recognition. They were handing me the authority, the responsibility, the burden. I looked at the folder again, at the evidence that my stepsister's recklessness had been the doorway through which a foreign actor gained access, at the consequences that had cascaded from that decision, at the 9 months of silence, at the nearly fatal explosion, at the memorial service my family hadn't attended, at the comments Hannah had made on base, at everything. A single thought moved through me. She never believed her actions had consequences. Hale must have read the shift in my expression because he spoke again. Carver, this is not vengeance. This is protocol. We aren't asking you to punish anyone. We're asking you to report facts. Facts, I echoed. Facts, he repeated firmly. Her intent may factor into the final assessment, but her involvement is now confirmed. I took a slow breath. Inhale, hold, release. I'll file the memorandum. Hale nodded once. Good. We need it by 1800. I stood. The oversight officer hesitated. Major, are you all right? I met his eyes. I wasn't the one who created this situation. He nodded slowly. But you're the one who has to finish it. When I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, thinner, sharper. This wasn't the quiet of reintegration. This wasn't the uncertainty of suspicion. This was the moment before consequences become real. I walked down the corridor toward the exit, my boots striking the tile in steady rhythm. Outside, JBLM was humming with normal activity PT groups, running drills, vehicles moving across the lot, officers reviewing schedules. None of them knew that a single report I would write in the next few hours would alter the trajectory of an entire SEAL candidate's life. They didn't know that the accusation would come not from a superior, not from a stranger, but from a sister. And not out of spite, but out of necessity. If you've ever stood at the threshold where personal loyalty collides with justice and realized only one of them can walk forward with you, then you know exactly how it felt to carry that folder across the base and prepare to put my signature on the truth. The training auditorium at JBLM was one of those cavernous military spaces designed more for function than comfort, rows of steel-framed seats, muted lighting, acoustic panels that swallowed echoes before they could reach the ceiling. It could hold nearly 400 personnel, and on that particular afternoon, it was full. Representatives from multiple units, rotating SEAL teams, intelligence officers, logistics, staff, and senior command had been ordered to attend the quarterly joint operational briefing. I had attended dozens of these events in my career, always quietly, always discreetly, always blending into the side rows so no one would notice the analyst who guided missions from behind classified screens. But today, I had been instructed to sit near the front, not hidden, not in the shadows. Front row center, 2 seats from the aisle. That alone was enough to stir whispers. When I entered, conversations paused. Officers glanced toward me, then back at one another. SEAL trainees from Hannah's rotation shifted in their seats, whispering questions, and Hannah herself sat halfway back on the right side of the auditorium, leaning in close to her teammate while her jaw clenched in undeniable tension. She had been trying to hold herself together for days, but the investigation's quiet weight was already pressing down on her, and she felt it even through the bravado she wore like armor. I took my seat without acknowledging anyone, maintaining the same steady presence I had carried since returning to JBLM. The lights dimmed slightly, the murmurs settled, then the doors at the side of the auditorium opened and the command delegation entered. General Bishop stepped onto the stage first, followed by Lieutenant General Harmon, Major General Ruiz, and Brigadier General Avery. If the auditorium hadn't been silent already, it would have been then. These were not men who appeared at routine briefings not together, and certainly not unannounced. They carried with them the kind of presence that made even seasoned operators sit straighter. Bishop approached the podium, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't begin with the typical opener. He didn't mention joint readiness or operational goals. He looked out across the room and spoke a single sentence. Before we proceed with today's agenda, there is a recognition long overdue. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. My pulse stayed steady. I knew what was coming. Not the words, not the exact choreography, but the inevitable direction of the moment. Bishop continued. There are individuals in this room who believe their work goes unnoticed because it is quiet, because it is classified, because it does not leave a signature in the traditional sense. He paused. But sometimes the quietest actions save the loudest lives. A few officers glanced toward me, unsure but suspicious. Hannah stiffened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. Before she could process what was happening, Bishop gestured toward the aisle. "Major Riley Carver," he said, his voice resonating through the room front and center. The auditorium shifted around me. Heads turned, muscles tightened. Hannah froze completely, visibly frozen, as if her mind refused to translate the sentence into meaning. She whispered something to her teammate, but her voice cracked mid-word. I stood, smoothed my uniform, and walked toward the stage with measured steps. Every sound in the room, from boots tapping to whispers fading, seemed to dim around the edges. When I reached the center of the stage, Bishop faced me directly. "Major Carver," he said, "your service inside intelligence operations has been kept from public view by design. Your record is not fully known to those in this room, but the impact of your actions on national security is undeniable." He turned slightly toward the audience. "This soldier led a covert operation responsible for the recovery of American personnel in Hasaka province last year." A wave of shock rippled across the auditorium. Hostage recovery stories circulated in special operations circles, but the people behind them never stood on stage. Bishop continued. "During that operation, an unauthorized breach compromised mission safety. Despite that breach, Major Carver entered the field, independently restored essential systems, and prevented a catastrophic loss." Another pause. Another ripple. Hannah's teammates stared at me, whispering rapidly. Hannah didn't whisper at all. She didn't blink. She just stared, her face draining of color as each sentence chipped away at her assumptions. Bishop reached behind the podium and lifted a small velvet box. For exceptional service, bravery under threat, and operational leadership, he said, the Joint Special Operations Command awards Major Riley Carver the Distinguished Service Commendation. And then, before he pinned the medal to my uniform, he turned to the audience and added one more detail, the detail that detonated the entire room. Major Carver is currently assigned to a classified Tier 1 command cell. Her rank, responsibilities, and operational history have been restricted by national security directives. Today, we declassify only enough to honor her properly. Silence. Absolute silence broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling lights. And then, stirring. Realization. Shock. Respect. Confusion. Admiration. Everything rising at once from every section of the auditorium, including the row where Hannah sat. She looked like someone had cut the ground out from under her. Her eyes darted between me, the generals, and the trainees around her, who now stared at her with dawning horror because they remembered every word she had said about me. They remembered the laughter. They remembered her arrogance. They remembered calling me desk duty. And now they were seeing the truth. She hadn't just humiliated herself privately. She had humiliated herself publicly. Spectacularly. Bishop pinned the medal to my uniform. Harmon came forward next, extended his hand, and said, "Well done, Major." Ruiz followed. Avery followed. Each handshake, each nod, each gesture was another layer of validation, another strike against the narrative Hannah had built her entire identity on. When the generals stepped back, Bishop turned to the crowd again. "This is what quiet excellence looks like," he said. "This is what discipline, integrity, and courage look like. Remember that the loudest voice in the room is very rarely the strongest." His gaze flicked purposefully, unmistakably toward the right side of the auditorium, toward Hannah. It was only a second, but the entire room felt it, and so did she. When the ceremony concluded, I stepped back into my seat with the same calm posture I had walked in with, but everything around me had changed. Officers approached with quiet respect. Operators nodded slightly as I passed. Even those who didn't understand the full story could sense that a hierarchy had shifted in real time. And Hannah remained seated long after everyone else stood. Her teammates leaned toward her, whispering frantically, trying to piece together how she could have misread me so catastrophically. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because humiliation is never felt more acutely than when truth rises publicly and without mercy. And for the first time in her life, she was forced to see me without the distorted lens she had built to protect her ego. If you've ever watched someone who underestimated you finally face the full weight of reality with witnesses all around them, then you understand exactly why that auditorium stayed quiet long after the applause faded, because justice when delivered publicly echoes louder than any humiliation spoken in private. The auditorium emptied slowly, as if no one quite knew how to return to normal routine after what they had witnessed. Praise followed me in low, restrained tones, the kind that carries more weight than applause ever could. A few officers approached to shake my hand. Others simply nodded with a quiet respect that didn't need explanation. I acknowledged each gesture, maintaining the same calm, measured posture that had carried me through every moment since returning to JBLM. But even as I stepped out into the hallway, I could feel a different kind of tension gathering behind me. A hesitant, shaky presence, a shadow made of guilt and panic. Hannah. I didn't turn immediately. I walked several steps down the corridor toward the exit before I heard the soft but uneven sound of boots jogging to catch up. Riley, wait. The voice cracked. Not with anger, not with arrogance, with fear. I stopped but didn't face her yet. When I finally turned, she was standing in the center of the hallway, eyes red and watery, breathing shallowly like someone who had just sprinted uphill. She tried to compose herself, wiping her face quickly, as if pretending she hadn't been crying. It didn't work. Nothing could hide the tremor in her hands or the panic in her eyes. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice was small. Something I had never heard from her. She wasn't trying to perform this time. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no audience, just us. I nodded once. She exhaled shakily, relieved I hadn't walked away. "I messed up," she said immediately. No hesitation. The words tumbled out of her like they had been clawing their way up her throat for days. I know I messed up. I know I shouldn't have installed that software. I know I shouldn't have talked to that contractor. Her voice broke entirely. I just wanted to be noticed. She pressed the heel of her hand to her forehead as tears spilled again. I wanted to stand out. I didn't want to be average. I didn't think it was serious. Nobody told me it was dangerous. I thought... She stopped choking on the words. I waited. She kept going. I thought it would make me look proactive, like I cared about my team, like I was trying to improve things. She shook her head violently. I didn't know it would cause all of that. All of that. She couldn't even say the words. Couldn't say near fatal. Couldn't say compromised mission. Couldn't say classified breach. Couldn't say 9 months where my name lay under a cross on military records. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she whispered. I was stupid. I studied her quietly. She wasn't lying. She wasn't manipulating. Not right now. This was raw fear, the fear of consequences finally catching up to a person who had spent her entire life believing they would never apply to her. Riley. Her voice thinned almost to nothing. Please, please don't let this ruin my career. There it was. Not apology, not accountability, not understanding. Fear of consequences. Fear of losing the identity she had built so aggressively, the identity she believed made her superior to everyone, including me. If they discharge me, she continued, I'll never get into another program. I'll lose everything I've worked for. I'll be nothing. I let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle between us like a weight. Then I spoke. Calm, controlled, professional. You're a SEAL, I said. You don't get to make excuses. She flinched as if struck. But you had training, I said. You had protocol briefings. You were warned explicitly never to install unauthorized software. But he said, and you believed him. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because it made you feel important. Because it fed your pride. Because you valued being admired more than being responsible. Her mouth trembled. I didn't think it would actually matter, she whispered. Everything matters, I said. In our world, everything matters. She sank back against the wall like the weight of her actions had finally hit her full force. Please, she begged again. You can talk to them. You can explain I didn't mean harm. You can? I shook my head once. Intent doesn't erase impact. You know that. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. For a moment, she looked impossibly young, like the child who had weaponized insecurity into cruelty but had never learned how to face the aftermath of her choices. She dropped her hands and looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes. You could fix this, she whispered. You've already proven you can change anything. I can't change protocol, I said. And I won't. Her expression hardened suddenly not into strength, but into panic-fueled anger. So that's it, she demanded. You're just going to let them destroy my life. You destroyed your own life, I said quietly. When you decided admiration mattered more than discipline. Her breath came fast. Too fast. You hate me, she whispered. You always have. I don't hate you, I said. I've never hated you. She stared at me confused. Then why won't you help me? I took a slow breath. Because helping you means letting other people pay the price for your mistakes. She shook her head again. You want me to fail, she insisted. You want to win. You want to watch me fall. No, I said. I want you to grow up. She looked stunned, genuinely stunned, because in all her life no one had ever spoken to her with honesty instead of indulgence. And then came the sentence that shifted the room. The memorandum is already filed, I said. The investigation is moving forward. She stared at me horrified. You reported me. I reported the truth. Her eyes filled again. You could have warned me. Would it have changed anything I asked? She didn't answer, because the answer was no. For years, Hannah had lived inside a world where consequences were theoretical, where she believed she could get away with bending rules because adults would fix her messes, or the military would overlook her impulsiveness, or someone else would clean up after her. But this consequence didn't bend. This consequence didn't wait. This consequence had a name and a file and an inevitable process behind it. She took a shaky step toward me. "Riley, please, I'm begging you." I took a step back, not out of fear, but out of boundary. "This isn't personal," I said. "It's protocol. It's justice." "Justice," she repeated the word, twisting in her mouth. "For who I held her gaze. For everyone who almost died because of your decision." She closed her eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then she whispered the only honest sentence she had said all day. "I never thought it would catch up to me." "Everything catches up eventually," I said. And with that, I stepped past her and walked down the corridor toward the exit. She didn't follow. She didn't call my name. She didn't try to argue. She just sank to the floor, shoulders shaking, finally meeting the version of herself she had spent her entire life avoiding. If you've ever watched someone reach the point where excuses no longer save them, where consequences arrive like a mirror they can't look away from, then you understand why the hallway stayed unbearably quiet as I walked away, my report already in the hands of the people who would decide her fate. 3 days after I filed the memorandum, JBLM's front gate called the command building with a request that made the duty officer's eyebrows jump halfway to his hairline. A civilian man, loud, agitated, refusing to leave, was demanding to see me by name. By rank. By full name he should not have had access to. The caller ID flagged him as Mark Carver, my stepfather. And the first thought that crossed my mind was simple, steady, unsurprised. Of course he would show up. Because men like Mark never consider boundaries real, never consider rules applicable, never consider their authority anything less than absolute, even when it collapses beneath them. I walked to the admin building entrance while security delayed him at the reception station. Through the glass doors, I saw him pacing like a caged animal, his face red with fury, his fists balled, his chest heaving with self-righteous anger. He wore a Navy veteran jacket he hadn't earned nearly as much as he believed he had. The moment he spotted me, he stormed forward, slamming his palm on the counter. "You!" he barked. Finally, the security officer stiffened. "Sir, lower your voice. Don't tell me what to do. My daughter is being targeted because of her. My family is being ripped apart." He jabbed a finger toward me like I was an intruder in his home. I stepped forward, posture, neutral expression, calm. "Mark, don't mark me," he snapped. "You think you can stroll back from the dead and start destroying lives? You think you can walk around acting like you're better than us?" His volume echoed through the waiting area. Soldiers paused. Staff froze. An uncomfortable tension spread. I let him finish. Let him burn through the first wave of anger because anger is impulsive. What came after would be the truth. "You reported Hannah," he said, pointing his whole arm at me now. "You filed some damn military accusation. Now the command is calling her in. She's under review. Her career, her future is on the line." "It is," I said evenly, "because she breached security protocol." "She made a mistake," he shouted. "She's young. She was tricked by some contractor. She didn't know she should have." For a moment, just a moment, his face morphed from rage into shock, as if he couldn't process a version of me that didn't fold under his voice. "You listen to me, Riley," he growled, stepping close enough that the security officer braced to intervene. "Family protects each other. Family doesn't put family in danger. You are tearing this family apart." That was the moment the silence inside me shifted. Not broken, just shifted. "I didn't put her in danger," I said softly. "She put me in danger." Mark blinked, thrown off balance. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means the breach she created," I said, nearly got me killed. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Not yet. So I continued. Calm, precise, factual. Each sentence another scalpel cutting through the fog of his imagined hierarchy. Her unauthorized software installation gave foreign actors access to a UAV transmission. That breach compromised a mission. That mission resulted in a mortar strike. That strike sent me into 9 months of classified isolation while the Army declared me dead. Mark's face drained of color. You're lying, he whispered, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. You're twisting things around. Am I? I reached into my folder, the one I had carried all morning for this exact moment, and slid a single tablet across the counter. Locked to one video file. Classified clearance required. But the security officer beside us had the authority to authorize Mark's viewing in my presence, under my instruction for the purpose of formal notification. He unlocked it, tapped play. The footage wasn't dramatic, not cinematic, just screen-recorded packets of encrypted transmissions, data streams, device signatures. But the timestamps were undeniable, the device ID impossible to misinterpret, the sender unmistakable. And when the screen shifted to the FBI-tagged contractor logs, Mark flinched like someone had struck him. No, he muttered. No, that can't be. She wouldn't. She's not. His voice thinned. She wouldn't do something like that. She did, I said gently. Whether intentionally or recklessly, she did. He stared at the screen as if looking hard enough would rewrite the evidence. She said it was just a settings update. She said they told her it would speed up the tablet. She didn't mean intent does not erase impact. He swallowed hard. His jaw trembled not from sadness, but from the one emotion he had spent his entire life avoiding. Accountability. I raised her better than that, he whispered. Did you? I asked. The question hit him like a blunt weapon. His head snapped up. What did you say? I held his gaze without flinching. Did you raise her to be disciplined? Did you teach her to respect protocol? Did you teach her to think before acting, to evaluate risk, to listen when warned? Mark shook his head, backing away a step. I taught her to be strong. No, I said. You taught her to be loud. And you confused the two. The security officer looked away to hide the shift in expression he couldn't entirely contain. Mark's breathing turned ragged. You always hated her, he spat weakly. You always wanted to be better. I didn't need to want that, I said. I just became it. His eyes widened, his ego fracturing under a truth he had never once allowed himself to consider, that the girl he had dismissed, belittled, mocked, minimized, had outgrown every small box he had ever tried to place her in. You're trying to ruin her, he said, but the sentence came out thin, brittle, empty. No, I said. She ruined herself. I'm just holding up the mirror. He sagged back against the wall, the weight of reality pressing down like gravity finally corrected. She could lose everything, he whispered. Yes, I said. She could. And you won't stop it. I can't, I said, and I won't, because this wasn't revenge. This wasn't bitterness. This wasn't payback for the childhood he tried to erase me inside. This was justice. Protocol. Necessity. Consequences, the one language he had never spoken but now had no choice but to understand. Mark's tears surprised even him. One slipped down his cheek before he angrily wiped it away. I protected her, he said hoarsely. All her life. I did everything for her. I nodded. And now she needs to protect herself. She can't, he whispered. Not from this. Then I said quietly, maybe it's time she learns. For a long moment he didn't speak. Couldn't. His world, the hierarchy he had built where Hannah shone, and I was a shadow, was dissolving in front of him. And for the first time he had to face the truth. Not all strength is loud. Not all leadership looks like force. Not all value is measured by volume. He looked up at me, eyes empty, voice almost childlike. What happens now? Investigators will interview her, I said. They'll determine her level of culpability. They'll consider her intent, but they'll weigh her actions more. He nodded slowly, each movement mechanical. Will she go to prison? Probably not, I said honestly. Not unless she sold the data knowingly, but she will face repercussions. His voice cracked. And you're fine with that. I'm fine with the truth. I answered. Whatever it is. Mark leaned forward, exhaling shakily. You're not the same girl who used to live in my house. No, I said. I'm not. I don't know who you are now. You never did, I replied. That was the final blow. Not loud, not cruel, just true. He closed his eyes defeated, crushed under a reality he could no longer bend to his will. And when he finally spoke, it came out as nothing more than a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, I said gently. Only she can. He nodded, tears streaming now, unable to stop them. The hierarchy had collapsed. The pedestal he built had cracked. And the child he valorized at the expense of everyone else was no longer untouchable. Justice had rearranged the roles, and for once he was not on top. I turned to leave, and for the first time in his life, Mark didn't stop me, didn't bark an order, didn't dismiss me, didn't belittle me. All he said in a broken whisper that followed me all the way to the door was Riley. I'm sorry, I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the only closure a truth-teller needs. If you've ever watched a man built on bluster finally collapse under the weight of accountability, you understand exactly why the air inside that waiting room felt different when I stepped back into the sunlight, lighter, clearer, honest for the first time. The notice came through the chain of command on a cold Thursday morning, brief, clinical, and brutally direct. SEAL candidate Hannah Carver. Training status changed, immediate suspension pending formal review. No elaboration, no softening, no euphemisms. Just the institutional precision of a system finally catching up to her actions. Word spread fast. By noon, half the SEAL rotation whispered about it behind closed doors, while the other half pretended not to know anything at all. I maintained my routine buried in encrypted logs and mission debriefs, behaving exactly as protocol required, impartial, steady, unreachable. But the tremor in the air was impossible to miss. The kind of tremor that signals a life unraveling faster than the person inside it can comprehend. I knew without being told that she would come find me. Because Hannah never accepted consequences. She challenged them, argued them, tried to charm her way through them. And when all else failed, she begged someone to intervene on her behalf. Usually Mark, occasionally my mother. Now, with both of them shattered by the truth, there was only one person left she believed she could sway. Me. That evening, just after 1900 hours, I returned to my off-base rental, a small, sparsely furnished home on a quiet street outside Lakewood. It was the kind of place chosen not for comfort, but for anonymity. Lights off, curtains drawn. A safe bubble where I could finalize classified reports without distraction. I dropped my keys on the counter, stepped toward the living room, and froze. Someone was sitting on the floor beside my couch. Knees pulled to chest, shoulders shaking, face buried in trembling hands. Hannah. Her uniform jacket lay crumpled next to her. Her boots were unlaced. Her eyes were red enough to match the sunset bleeding through the blinds. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, smaller than she had ever allowed herself to be. How did you get in here? I asked. My voice stayed even. Professional, detached. She lifted her head slowly, revealing a face streaked with tears. Your door wasn't locked, she whispered. I knocked. You didn't hear. I panicked and tried the handle. She swallowed hard. It opened. I checked the lock. Indeed, I had been so deep in reports earlier that I'd forgotten to slide the deadbolt. Careless. A mistake I wouldn't make again. But not the point of tonight. Why are you here? I asked. She stood unsteady as if the weight of the day had hollowed her out. They suspended me, she said, voice cracking. They took my badge, my access card. They said I'm under formal investigation. They said I jeopardized operational security. Riley, they're talking about removing me from the program completely. She shook her head violently. This is everything to me. I can't lose this. I can't be... nothing. Her breath broke. Please, please help me. I can't, I said calmly. You already know that. A sob tore out of her. Not graceful, not controlled. Raw. She stumbled closer, gripping her hands together like someone clinging to a lifeline. I didn't know, she cried. I didn't know the software was dangerous. I didn't know the contractor was dirty. He told me it was safe. He told me it would help. He said everyone used it. I was stupid. I know I was stupid, but I didn't mean—" She stopped choking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." That was the moment her collapse shifted from panic into something achingly close to remorse. Genuine or desperate, it didn't matter yet. Pain has a way of peeling people open. "I woke up this morning," she said, "and my locker was empty. People were staring at me, whispering, treating me like I'm dangerous, like I'm already guilty." She exhaled a shaking breath. "I'm not a bad person, Riley. I swear I'm not. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be good enough." She took another step closer. "You know what that feels like." The sentence landed with a quiet thud, not because she was wrong, but because she was too late. Years too late. "I know what it feels like," I said, "and I learned to overcome it without breaking protocol." Her chest rose sharply. "Please don't let them take everything. Please talk to command. Tell them it was an accident. They'll listen to you. They clearly do. You're high-ranking, important. You know people." She flinched at her own wording. "You could save me." I inhaled slowly, then exhaled, and stepped back, intentionally creating distance she felt like a slap. "I'm not here to save you," I said. Her face crumpled. "Why?" she whispered. "Why won't you help me?" "You're my sister." "I'm your stepsister," I corrected. "And this isn't family business. It's federal business." She shook her head desperately. "But you care, don't you?" "Deep down, you have to care something." A long silence stretched between us. 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then I answered her honestly. "I care about the truth. I care about the people whose lives were put at risk because of your decision. I care about the operators who almost died. I care about the mission that was compromised. I care about the 9 months I spent buried in anonymity because of a breach you helped create." Her knees buckled slightly. I continued, voice steady but firm. "What I don't care about is protecting you from consequences you earned." Her breath hitched. "You don't mean that." I held her gaze. "I do. You're punishing me," she yelled, voice breaking into hysteria. "You want me to suffer. You've always been jealous. Stop. Just one word. Calm. Sharp. Absolute." She did. Her mouth snapped shut. The air in the room thickened. "You think this is about jealousy?" I asked. "No. This is about accountability. Something you've never had to face in your life." She shook her head, tears spilling again. "I was scared. I was naive. I didn't understand. Then this is how you learn." Another sob ripped through her. She pressed her palms together like she was praying. "Please, please, Riley, I'm begging you. I'll lose everything." I stepped toward the door and opened it. "Then maybe I said you should stop basing your entire identity on things you can lose." She froze, perfectly still, then asked in a trembling whisper, "So you're really not going to help me?" "No," I said. Calm, final. "You earned your consequences." The sentence shattered whatever was left of her composure. She let out a broken, wounded sound, one that came from a place deeper than pride, deeper than fear. She staggered back, arms wrapped around herself, her shoulders trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, she looked like a child again, lost and scared, and suddenly aware of how dangerous her own choices had been. But I didn't move toward her. I didn't soften. I didn't apologize for speaking truth. She needed not comfort. She wanted. She took one final look at me, hurt, disbelieving, hollow, and whispered, "I thought you'd save me." "Saving you," I said softly, "would be letting you avoid learning." She wiped her face, nodded once shakily, and walked out the door. I watched her go. Every step she took away from the house looked heavier than the last, as if the weight of her new reality settled deeper into her spine. And when the door finally closed behind her, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was inevitability. If you've ever witnessed the moment when someone who has always escaped consequences finally realizes there's nowhere left to run, then you understand why the air in my home felt different after she left. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just honest. And sometimes honesty is the sharpest form of justice the world has to offer. The days that followed marked the slow, methodical unwinding of two lives, one through formal investigation, the other through public humiliation without trial. Neither collapse was loud, neither was dramatic. They unfolded quietly in the way institutions dismantle illusions with steady, unrelenting precision. Hannah's downfall began at 600 the next morning when military police arrived at the SEAL candidate's barracks with a sealed envelope and a verbal directive candidate Carver. Report to OSI and JSOC Joint Inquiry Office. Immediately. No one explained. No one softened. No one made eye contact. In special operations culture, silence means severity. She stood in the hallway holding the envelope with trembling fingers while her teammates watched from behind half-opened doors. These were the same teammates who once admired her drive her boldness, her confidence. Now they stared at her with caution, uncertain whether they should pity her or distance themselves before the fallout touched them too. And the fallout spread fast. In under 12 hours, her name had been scrubbed from the weekly SEAL rotation board. Her upcoming evaluation form was locked. Her PT score entry was archived. Her locker was sealed. Procedures she once scoffed at, rules she claimed didn't matter, now dictated every hour of her day, every room she was allowed to enter, every question she had to answer. OSI began with the technical details: how she had met the contractor, how the software ended up on her assigned device, why the transmissions occurred in the exact timestamp window leading into the Hasaka operation. Every answer she gave was recorded, reviewed, cross-checked against data logs that didn't bend for emotion. She cried through most of it. They noted the tears, but didn't adjust to their questions. Accountability and national security cannot be negotiated through sympathy. Meanwhile, I kept my focus on the part of the mission still in motion. My role wasn't to monitor Hannah's interviews. My role was to finish assembling the final breach reconstruction for JSOC. In a secured room beneath the command building, I spent 3 days compiling every thread of evidence into a system map that showed exactly how the breach occurred, where it originated, how it spread, and why it escalated during the UAV feed. I didn't embellish. I didn't moralize. I didn't interpret motives. I documented facts. That was my duty. And duty comes before comfort, before relief, before personal conflict. But even with that clarity, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something settle in my chest, a mix of exhaustion, closure, and the kind of sadness that accompanies the truth when it finally emerges into the open. Truth may set you free, but it leaves debris behind. JSOC reviewed my reconstruction line by line. They asked targeted questions, verified timestamps, compared the breach to previous case studies. When the final review was complete, Director Hale closed the file and said, "Good work, Major. We now understand the sequence. You've done your part. My part." Those 3 words held more meaning than he knew, because my part wasn't just technical. It wasn't just operational. It was personal. It meant closing the door on years of history, years of being dismissed in my own home, years of Hannah believing she was stronger, smarter, destined for more. Now the truth was on record, and truth doesn't apologize. While the formal inquiry continued, the second collapse began, not in a secured room, but in a veterans community center across Tacoma. Every Wednesday, Mark met with a small group of retired service members, mostly Navy, mostly men, cut from the same cloth as him, men who admired his bluster because they mistook volume for valor. He'd held court there for years, telling stories about discipline, strength, toughness, raising a daughter worthy of the uniform. It didn't take long for the truth to reach them. Someone had read the local bulletin. Someone's nephew worked at JBLM. Someone overheard her name in a bar near the base. The rumor circulated like wildfire. His daughter is under investigation for compromising a mission. She caused a breach. The Army is looking into charges. JSOC is involved. The next time Mark walked into the center expecting his usual audience, the room didn't greet him with nods. It greeted him with silence. Not respectful silence. Accusatory silence. The worst kind a military man can face. He tried to joke, tried to regain footing, tried to wave it off, but someone finally asked the question none of his friends had ever dared ask before. "Is it true?" Mark's face darkened. "Mind your business," he snapped, but his voice wavered. Someone else pushed harder. "Your girl compromised an op." "That's serious." Another added, "What kind of training was she running that she didn't know better?" And the final blow came from a man who had served 25 years and lost 2 friends overseas. If she endangered operators, that's on you. You bragged about raising her right. The room shifted. A veteran's status isn't removed lightly, but respect is. And respect is the currency of their world. In one afternoon, Mark lost what he valued most: admiration, credibility. The pedestal he built for himself crumbled. He left the center early, shoulders hunched, face-pale, reputation bruised beyond repair. Meanwhile, I remained at JBLM finalizing the JSOC packet. Every sentence I wrote had weight. Every line contributed to the judgment that would determine Hannah's future, whether she would be discharged, reprimanded, reassigned, or, if evidence escalated, criminally charged. But I wrote it all without vengeance, without pettiness, without emotion. I wrote it because the mission demanded accuracy, and because truth is the foundation of every operator who survives long enough to understand that silence is not weakness, it is discipline. When I delivered the completed report to Hale, he accepted it with a nod. "We'll submit this to the Joint Review Board by tomorrow morning," he said. "After that, it's out of our hands." I stood at attention. "Understood." He studied me for a moment. "Carver, you handled this with clarity. Most people wouldn't have." "It's my duty," I said simply. "Duty and personal history rarely overlap cleanly," he replied. "But you stayed objective." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He dismissed me for the day. As I walked back toward my quarters, the air outside felt heavy with the kind of quiet that follows decisive action. The weight of what had transpired wasn't victory. It wasn't satisfaction. It was inevitability. Choices have consequences, always. You can delay them, outrun them, deny them. But eventually, they arrive. That evening, as the sky dimmed into a wash of purple and gold, I sat in my small living room, boots still on, staring at the commendation pinned to my uniform from the briefing earlier in the week. It glinted softly in the last rays of daylight, a reminder of the life I built on discipline, calculated restraint, and unwavering truth. A mirror to the life Hannah built on shortcuts, validation, and unearned confidence. And as I sat there, a simple thought settled over me. This was never about revenge. Revenge is emotional, impulsive, messy. Justice, when carried out correctly, is clean, unforgiving, precise. And the truth I had carried quietly for years, was finally free in the world. If you've ever reached the point where doing the right thing means watching the people who wronged you collapse under their own choices, then you understand why that night I slept deeper than I had in months, not out of triumph, but out of alignment, because for the first time, the consequences belonged to the person who earned them, not to the person who survived them. The week after the JSOC packet was submitted felt strangely quiet, as if the air around me had settled after months of turbulence. Not peaceful, just still. A stillness that follows decisive action, the kind that sits with you not as relief, but as truth finally taking its rightful place. But truth always leaves echoes, and one echo, one unfinished part of my life, pulled at me more strongly than the investigation, the consequences, or even the commendation pinned to my uniform. My mother. She had called only once since the confrontation at the house. Her voice had been small, tired, apologetic without forming the words. "Riley, if you have time, could you come by?" I knew why she asked, or at least why she thought she asked. She wanted to talk about Hannah, about Mark, about the chaos unraveling around her. But beneath all of that waited something deeper, something decades overdue. So on my next approved off-base window, I drove back to the Tacoma house. Same chipped paint, same cracked driveway, same tension strung between the wooden boards like an old song that never learned a new melody. When I pulled up, the house looked dimmer than before, lights on, but muted like a place holding its breath. My mother opened the door before I even knocked. Her face looked older, lines, deeper eyes, swollen with exhaustion. Not from age, from strain. "Riley," she whispered, stepping aside. "Come in." I walked past her, scanning the living room instinctively. Training doesn't switch off, not even at home. No sign of Mark, no boots by the door, no jacket thrown across the couch. "He's not here," she said, reading my posture. "He's at the Veterans Center. Or, he was. He leaves a lot lately. Comes back angry." She swallowed. "Angry at you." "That's not new," I said. She flinched, but didn't deny it. We sat at the dining table, same table we'd had since I was 12, still bearing the faint scratches from homework nights and silent dinners where Mark's authority hung heavy in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She twisted her hands together. I waited. Then, she whispered, "I don't know what to do." The sentence broke something open inside her. Her eyes filled, her breath trembled, and she pressed a hand to her mouth like she was trying to quiet a sob. "Everything is falling apart," she said. "Hannah's career, Mark's reputation. He blames you. He says you ruined our family." I held her gaze. "Did I?" She shook her head instantly, fiercely. "No. No, Riley. They did this. They brought this on themselves." She said it like a confession, like a truth she had never been allowed to say out loud. She wiped her face with trembling fingers. "I know you did the right thing. I know it." Her voice cracked. "But knowing it doesn't make living in this house any easier." I leaned forward slightly. "Then leave." She froze. Breath caught mid-inhale. I continued, calm, direct. "Leave him, Mom. You don't owe him your life." Her eyes widened with fear, not of me, but of the question she'd been avoiding her entire adulthood. I can't just leave." "Why not?" "Because," she shook her head helplessly, "because it's complicated." "It's not," I said gently. "You're scared, but it's not complicated." She lowered her gaze to her hands, hands that had cooked meals under pressure, hands that had cleaned messes she didn't make, hands that had comforted a child while avoiding a man's temper. "He's not always bad," she whispered. "He can be protective. He can be supportive. He can be controlling," I corrected. "He can be cruel. He can be dismissive. And he taught Hannah that rules don't apply to her because she came from him, not you." Her shoulders trembled. I know. I didn't push harder. Not yet. I let silence do the work I couldn't. Silence can be more honest than any argument." After a long pause, she whispered, "I failed you." The sentence was so soft I almost didn't hear it, but its weight hit with the force of years. "I failed you," she repeated, tears spilling freely now. "I didn't protect you. I let him talk to you that way. I let him treat you that way. I let Hannah treat you that way. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I told myself you were strong enough. I told myself you understood. But you were a child. You were just a child." The apology cracked her open. Sobs shook her shoulders. She covered her face with both hands, crying in a way I had never seen, not restrained, not muted, not muffled behind closed doors. Raw, regretful, human. For a moment, she looked like the woman she had been before Mark. Gentle, terrified, young, unsure how she'd ever gotten trapped in a life she didn't recognize. I stood, slowly walked around the table and sat beside her. She leaned into me without hesitation, burying her face in my shoulder like she had the night Mark had raised his hand at her decades ago. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my sleeve. "I'm sorry I didn't choose you. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I didn't stop him. I'm sorry for all of it." I wrapped an arm around her, steady and quiet. "I know," I said softly. "And I forgive you." She sobbed harder, fingers gripping my arm. "How can you forgive me?" "Because you're trying now," I said. "And because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means understanding." She leaned back, wiping her cheeks. "I want to leave. I do. I'm just scared." "I know," I said, "but you won't be alone." She looked up sharply. "You'd help me." "I will," I said, "whenever you're ready." Her breath shook again. "What about Hannah? She has to face what she's done," I said. "You can support her emotionally, but you can't shield her from consequences." My mother nodded slowly, the truth settling into her bones. For the first time in decades, she wasn't shrinking away from reality, she was absorbing it. Is it wrong, she whispered, that part of me feels relieved. Relieved that she finally has to face something real. It's human, I said. Not wrong. She exhaled shakily, wiping the last of her tears. I wish I had been stronger for you. You can be stronger for yourself now, I said. She smiled weakly. I want that. I really do. A long silence followed, softer this time, not heavy, not strained. Healing silence, the kind made of truth instead of fear. Riley, she said quietly, I'm proud of you. The words landed with more weight than any commendation, any salute, any medal, because I had never heard them from her, not once, not even almost. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. You didn't become strong because of us. You became strong despite us. That's the part I'll never forgive myself for. Don't, I said. Use that guilt to build a different life, not to punish yourself. She nodded again, more grounded now, more certain. Maybe, she said tentatively, maybe it's time I stop waiting for him to change. It is, I said, because he won't. She inhaled deeply, the kind of breath someone takes at the beginning of a long overdue decision. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, I saw a glimmer of something I had never seen in her. Resolve. Quiet, trembling, but unmistakable. I'll start looking for a place, she said softly. Somewhere small. Somewhere peaceful. I'll help, I replied. Tell me what you need. She took my hand again. I just need to know. She whispered that you'll still be in my life. I'm here, I said. I'm not going anywhere. She smiled, weakly, tears welling again, but this time they weren't from fear or regret. They were from something closer to healing. When I left the house that evening, the sky had shifted into a wash of soft lavender and gold. The air felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally broken open, something buried for years beneath denial and silence. If you've ever had a moment where someone who failed you finally looked you in the eyes, acknowledged their harm, and chose truth over fear, then you understand why the road back to JBLM felt different that night. For the first time in a long time, the past wasn't chasing me. The future was waiting. The morning of the JSOC redeployment ceremony dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp Washington air that felt sharp enough to cut. At Joint Base, Lewis McChord events like this didn't happen often. They were reserved for missions whose significance rippled across branches, commands, and continents. And today, hundreds of service members gathered across the parade field dressed in formal uniforms, boots, polished ribbons gleaming beneath the winter sun. Rows of chairs had been arranged with rigid precision. Podiums stood ready. Flags stirred in the chilled breeze. This was not a small gathering. This was a statement. I stood off to the side near the staging tent as personnel hurried through final checks. A staff sergeant clipped my final award on my uniform. Another adjusted the line of my jacket. A public affairs officer gave me a nod of quiet respect. Even after the first salute days earlier, after the commendation in the auditorium, after the whispers that spread across the base, nothing prepared me for this scale. For the reality that the life I'd lived in silence for so long was stepping into the open, not as rumor, not as mystery, but as truth. Tan Hoc Tam Lien Ho Da Kum Yun. I had been ordered to attend, not because I needed to, but because the mission demanded transparency, and because JSOC wanted the base to know exactly who had carried the burden behind the scenes. As I stepped from the tent toward the field, the crowd shifted. Heads turned subtly, postures straightened. Officers I'd never spoken to nodded with a level of respect one doesn't manufacture. I moved to the designated seating area near the front, but I didn't sit. I scanned the field habit instinct caution, and that was when I saw her, Hannah Carver, off to the far side of the field just behind a row of junior enlisted. Not in uniform, she wasn't allowed to wear it. Not standing with a unit, she no longer had one. Not hiding, though she easily could have. She was standing still, hands clasped tightly in front of her eyes, fixed on me with a mixture of regret, grief, and something like acceptance. She looked older than she had weeks earlier. Not in age, but in weight. Carried weight. Earned weight. Her face held none of the arrogance she once wore like armor, none of the confidence she flaunted, none of the entitlement, just quiet remorse, and something else respect. For the first time in her life, Hannah saw me clearly, not as competition, not as annoyance, not as the quiet stepsister she was raised to overshadow, but as someone she never understood, and now couldn't ignore. She didn't wave, didn't move. She simply nodded once small, almost imperceptible, but real. I returned nothing. Not yet. Not here. Because this moment wasn't about reconciliation. Not today. It was the culmination of something larger than her, larger than us, larger than our family. As I took my position, General Bishop stepped to the podium, his presence commanding even in stillness. The murmur of the crowd faded instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the parade grounds, "today, we honor the men and women whose covert service has shaped the safety of our nation in ways most Americans will never know. We gather to acknowledge sacrifice, to recognize valor, and to reveal within authorized limits the contributions of personnel whose work has remained in shadows for years." He paused, scanning the field. Among those individuals is an officer whose leadership, precision, and resilience altered the trajectory of a critical joint operation, an officer who for 9 months remained officially deceased so the mission could proceed, an officer whose actions prevented catastrophic loss of life. The crowd leaned in collectively. Bishop's gaze shifted toward me. "Major Riley Carver," he said, voice firm and resonant front and center. A ripple moved through the field. Soldiers straightened. A whisper passed down the rows like electricity. I stepped forward, each footfall steady on the pavement. The weight of silence deepened around me, not tense, not uncertain. Reverent. Bishop continued as I approached. Major Carver's exemplary performance during Operation Silent Torrent provided critical intelligence that safeguarded operators and civilians alike. Her restraint under pressure, her endurance through covert conditions, and her unwavering commitment to the mission embody the highest standards of Joint Special Operations Command. At the foot of the podium, I stood at attention. Bishop faced me directly. "Major, he said you spent your life doing work few can comprehend. Today, we acknowledge what you can finally receive, openly gratitude." He reached for the small velvet-covered box held by a command sergeant major. Inside was a medal I had earned months earlier but could not claim until now. The Distinguished Service Cross. The crowd shifted stunned into deeper silence. It was not a common award. Not in this branch. Not at this base. Not under these circumstances. He pinned it to my uniform. For extraordinary heroism, he said, voice steady, and for service rendered with integrity beyond expectation. He stepped back and saluted. The salute wasn't ceremonial, it was personal, and the field responded as one. Hundreds of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines raised their hands in perfect unison. The sound was crisp, a single collective motion, freezing the moment in time. I returned the salute, calm, sharp, precise. The air felt charged, electric. Real. A moment built from every unseen hour, every buried mission, every quiet decision I had made since the day I enlisted. When the salute broke, Bishop nodded for me to step to the microphone. "Major," he said quietly, "the floor is yours." I turned toward the crowd, a sea of uniforms blurred with the winter light, faces expectant, curious, respectful. I cleared my throat, the cold air stinging for a second. "I'm not here today because I worked alone," I began. "I'm here because I served with people who trusted me, people who believed in the mission, people who never needed credit to keep doing what was right." The words carried with more resonance than I expected. My life, like many of yours, has been defined by silence. Silent hours, silent decisions, silent sacrifices. Some of those sacrifices were public. Some were buried. Some were personal. My eyes drifted briefly toward the far edge of the field, toward Hannah. She stiffened slightly, but she didn't look away. "What matters," I continued, "is not whether we receive recognition, but whether we uphold duty even when no one is watching." Heads nodded quietly. A few officers folded their arms in approval. "I stand here today," I said, grateful. Not for the award, but for the chance to come home, to serve again, to continue doing the work that keeps others safe. I paused, and for the reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually demands daylight. The last sentence struck the field with a subtle weight. Not aggressive, not pointed, just honest. Bishop returned to the podium as I stepped aside, but his words faded behind me as I let my gaze sweep the crowd once more. Then it stopped. On her. Hannah. She stood straighter than before, shoulders drawn back slightly, eyes bright not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet mix of regret and respect. She mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." For the first time since the investigation began, something inside me loosened, not forgiveness, not comfort, but space. Space for the idea that someday maybe she would grow into the accountability she'd been forced to face. Not today, but someday. The ceremony concluded with honors and commands. Units filed out, officers mingled, families reunited. As I stepped off the stage, dozens approached me, shaking hands, offering gratitude, sharing stories. But amid the crowd, I felt one presence move closer. Not touching, not speaking, just standing near enough that I could sense her. Hannah. She didn't attempt to intercept me, didn't plead, didn't apologize again. She simply stood beside the path I walked, head bowed slightly, hands clasped, and let me pass. For the first time in our lives, she understood. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And justice isn't vengeance, it's balance. As I walked toward the exit of the parade field, the winter sun warmed my shoulders. The future felt open, quiet, ready. If you've ever reached a moment where the world finally recognizes what you carried alone for years, then you understand why every step I took felt lighter. Not because the journey was easy, but because it was finally undeniably mine. The ceremony ended hours ago, yet the echoes of boots on concrete and the crisp snap of salutes still lingered in my mind as I walked alone along the quiet path behind the operations building. The winter sun had begun to sink behind the tree line, turning the sky into a wash of soft amber and steel blue. It was the kind of evening where the air felt honest, clean, stripped bare of noise and ego. Perfect for reflection. Perfect for truth. I found a bench overlooking the training field empty now, just faint outlines of earlier formations in the frost-brushed grass. I sat, straightened my uniform coat, and let out a slow breath. For the first time since returning from the dead on paper anyway, I felt the weight of everything settle into something steady. Not light, but no longer crushing. A quiet I had earned. If someone had told me as a child, the quiet one in the Carver house, the one always tiptoeing between tension and silence, that one day I would stand on a parade field as generals saluted me, I would have thought they were talking about someone else. Because my strength was never loud, never forceful, never dramatic. It was quiet. The kind of quiet people mistake for weakness. The kind that predators assume they can control. The kind toxic families believe they can bury beneath louder personalities. But silence, true silence, isn't submission. It's awareness, observation, discipline, and eventually it becomes power. I rested my hands on my knees and let the memory of the last few months roll through me like a slow, turning tide. My death on paper, my return under cover, the humiliation at the motor pool, the investigations, the confrontations, the truth breaking through every place it had been suppressed. And through it all, one lesson threaded itself quietly into every moment. The lesson I had learned long before JSOC ever noticed me. The lesson the world never taught Hannah. The lesson my family never understood. Strength is not volume. It is consistency. It is choosing your response, even when someone else is screaming theirs. It is staying grounded when others become chaotic. It is knowing who you are when others insist you are less. That realization had taken years to settle into my bones. Years of endurance, reflection, and decisions made in the dark, literal and metaphorical. I looked at my reflection faintly mirrored in the polished surface of my medal, the Distinguished Service Cross. recognition for something I could barely talk about, a symbol of what happens when duty outlives fear. My voice broke the quiet, soft, steady, almost like I was speaking to the shadows of the girl I used to be. People think justice feels like triumph, I said, but most of the time it feels like exhaling after being underwater for too long. The wind nudged a strand of hair across my cheek. I tucked it back. Justice isn't about punishing someone. It's about restoring balance. It's about choosing truth when lies are easier. It's about letting consequences land where they belong instead of carrying them yourself. My family had spent years placing the weight of their choices on me, silently expecting me to absorb their dysfunction, their favoritism, their denial. They thought silence meant acceptance, but silence in my hands became strategy, one that led me here. When you've lived surrounded by people who mistake cruelty for strength, I continued, you learn that discipline isn't just a military word. It's a survival tactic. It becomes the difference between reacting emotionally and responding with purpose. My mother's tear-stained face flashed in my mind, the apology she had finally offered, the truth she had finally acknowledged, the quiet resolve she had found despite fear. And Hannah standing at the far edge of the parade field, remorse replacing arrogance for the first time in her life. Both moments were painful and necessary. You can love people, I whispered, and still say no to the parts of them that hurt you. I leaned back against the bench and let the discipline of years settle through me. And you can forgive people, I added softly, without inviting them back to the places they broke. Forgiveness isn't an open door. It's a boundary, a choice, a declaration that the past no longer gets to steer the present. Hannah's consequences were hers. Mark's humiliation was his. My mother's awakening was her own. And my path finally belonged to me. As the last daylight faded, I felt something shift in my chest. Not closure, that's too clean a word. More like alignment. The puzzle pieces of my life had finally settled into an order that made sense. Pain where pain belonged. Accountability where accountability was earned. And peace finally, for the first time since childhood, growing quietly in the space left behind. If there's one thing I've learned, I murmured, it's that silence can build you or break you. My breath came out slowly. For years, my silence was self-defense. Later, it became discipline. And now it's clarity. The bass loudspeakers crackled faintly in the distance as evening announcements played. The hum of generators echoed through the wind. Lights flickered on across the field. JBLM preparing for another night, another mission, another cycle of service. I stood brushing frost from my gloves, letting the weight of my uniform settle with familiar comfort. I used to think justice was something you chase, I said quietly. But the truth is, justice is something you become when you stop letting other people define your worth. I took a step forward, then another. The world around me softened with evening as I walked across the field toward the main road. I didn't look back. There was no need. The past had been acknowledged. The truth had been spoken. The hierarchy had shifted. The consequences had landed. And the silent girl who grew up in a house where her voice didn't matter had become a woman whose silence carried authority. As the first stars appeared over the horizon, I murmured the final words not to anyone else but to myself. I am still here. I am still standing. And I am finally heard. If you've ever survived a world that tried to shrink you, silence you, overlook you, then you know exactly why those words mattered more than any medal, any salute, any public recognition. Because in the end, justice is not the moment others finally see you. Justice is the moment you finally see yourself. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, through the silence, the humiliation, the discipline, the justice, the consequences, then you already understand something most people never say out loud. The deepest scars are not always earned on the battlefield. Sometimes they're carved at a kitchen table by the very people who raised you. Sometimes they're pressed into your shoulders by the weight of expectations you were never meant to carry. Sometimes they're lodged behind your ribs because a family member looked you in the eyes and decided you weren't worth defending. And sometimes, maybe most painfully of all, you survive not just what they did to you, but the way they dismissed you for surviving it. If you've ever lived that even once, then this next part is for you. I want to speak to the person you were before the world hardened you, the child who stayed quiet to keep the peace, the teenager who tried harder than anyone realized, the adult who learned to carry responsibilities that weren't yours because no one else would step up, the part of you that still wonders after everything why certain people never saw your worth until it was too late. I'm not asking you to relive your worst moments. I'm asking you to acknowledge them, not because they define you, but because they shaped the strength you carry now. Strength born in silence is its own kind of force. People underestimate it because it doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need applause. It simply endures. And endurance, real endurance, outlasts arrogance every single time. I spent years believing that if I spoke up, I would only make things worse. That if I stayed quiet, the storm would pass. That if I kept my head down, people would eventually see who I truly was. But the truth is far simpler. The people who wanted me small were never going to see me clearly, no matter how loudly or softly I lived. I had to step into my own voice, my own discipline, my own justice. And so do you. When I finally faced the people who had underestimated me, when the truth came out, when consequences settled where they belonged, when silence finally became power instead of protection, I realized something simple but universal. None of us walk this road alone. Somewhere out there, someone is living a story parallel to yours. Someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be the quiet one, the overlooked one, the responsible one, the one who held the family together without anyone noticing, the one they underestimated until it was too late, the one who rose anyway. And that's why I'm asking you this now, not as a soldier, not as an officer, not as a character in a story, but as someone who understands the weight of every unspoken truth. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, tell me your story. Tell me about the time someone dismissed you when you were trying your hardest. Tell me about the moment you realized you couldn't rely on people who claimed to love you. Tell me about the words that cut deeper than anything physical ever could. Tell me about the siblings who competed instead of supported, the parents who blamed instead of protected, the relatives who tore you down instead of lifting you up. Tell me the truth they tried to bury. Tell me what you carried for years because no one else would carry it with you. Tell me how you survived. Or if you're still surviving, tell me what you're fighting for now. You don't need to be a soldier to understand silent strength. You don't need medals to have lived through battles. You don't need a parade field to know what it feels like to stand alone in a crowd. All you need is the courage to say, "This happened to me." That's more bravery than some people ever manage in a lifetime. I know some of you reading this have never told your stories out loud. Maybe you're still afraid. Maybe you still hear the voices of people who tried to make you feel small. Maybe you still carry the weight of everything left unsaid. But saying it even once is a kind of justice, a kind of reclamation, a quiet declaration that your voice matters, your truth matters, and your life is not defined by the people who underestimated it. And if you don't want to tell me your whole story, tell me one sentence, one moment, one truth. Because sometimes that's all it takes to break the silence. And who knows, your sentence might be the one someone else needed to hear. There are people who come to these stories because they want entertainment. But there are also people who come here because they need community. They need validation. They need a reminder that being underestimated doesn't make them weak. It makes them the kind of strong that grows in the dark and refuses to die. So this is your space, your invitation, your moment. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, judged, minimized, or silenced by the very people who should have lifted you up, I want to hear you, right here. Right now. You're not invisible. You're not alone. You're not the only one who had to build strength where love should have been, and your voice, no matter how quiet, deserves to be heard. So tell me your story. Tell me what they got wrong. Tell me what you survived. Tell me what you learned. Tell me who you became not because of them, but in spite of them. I'll be here, listening, reading, standing witness in the way I once wished someone stood witness for me. So once more clearly and with all the weight it deserves, if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, tell me your story.